The apocalypse destroyed the world, but my OP space skill kept attracting every capable woman I met. Time stopped inside my private subspace, so I could keep an entire city's food fresh while everyone else was starving. That was how a fire-wielding chef and two gorgeous powerhouse sisters ended up living under my roof. 10 days after the outbreak, the chef was cooking in my kitchen. The younger sister had chosen me as her partner, and her older sister was arguing over breakfast like losing to me had only made her louder. Outside, survivors fought over canned soup. Inside, 3 future legends fought over my food, my decisions, and, whether they admitted it or not, my attention. My name was Noah Sterling. This was Lakebridge, and I'd already watched the world die once. I'd returned 27 days before the first zombie with my combat rank erased and 1 cheat intact. Anything inside my private subspace stayed perfectly fresh. 27 days earlier, outside my Lakebridge townhouse, I sold a $3 billion stake in Sterling Holdings for $1 billion cash and turned my street into a delivery truck parking lot. The drivers filmed the rich orphan buying a grocery district while their dispatcher group chat laughed. Then I opened the subspace, and 18 trucks emptied in seconds. Crates, freezers, water, produce. Gone. The man recording searched beneath the straps like the food might be hiding from him, while his partner climbed into an empty trailer and came back offended by physics. Anything stored inside came out exactly as it entered, even years later. The space was huge but finite, and my restored body was weak enough to lose a serious argument with a refrigerator. Still, I had future knowledge and the same space foundation that had once made me the Void Sovereign. That power had kept me alive long enough to lose everyone. My most loyal guard died protecting me. The strongest lightning beast I knew became food during a starvation winter, and eventually, every radio went silent. I survived until survival felt pointless, so my second life began with one decision: I would never become the last man alive again. The convoy had barely cleared when my uncle summoned me to Sterling Holdings. An hour later, my uncle stood behind my father's old desk and performed Concerned Uncle of the Year, asking whether grief had made me reckless. My uncle wasn't worried about me. He was checking whether I knew he'd arranged the crash that killed my parents and stolen their shares afterward. My father had given him 10% of the company, and the man decided a fortune was insulting because it wasn't the whole fortune. His spoiled son had exposed the murder during my first apocalypse, when laws and consequences were already dead. I'd learned it too late to save my parents or punish the man hiding behind that family smile. This time, I was early. My uncle offered to undo the sale if I trusted him. I left his papers untouched and claimed pork prices were about to explode, so I planned to corner the market. His eyes softened immediately. The pork story convinced him I'd become harmless, and that false confidence bought me 27 days. Outside, the finder I'd hired called about a one-eared black dog caged behind an illegal slaughter business. That missing ear belonged to the future Storm King, the strongest lightning beast from my first life, and right then, a butcher was pricing him by weight. And yes, I'd once eaten him. Would you have judged me? Fair. I'd been starving, neither of us had awakened, and there was no food left. In my defense, he'd tasted incredible. Actually, no, that made it worse. Forget I said that. I owed him a rescue and a better timeline. The business owner greeted me like 2 employees, and a locked gate made him untouchable. I called the dog stolen. He laughed and demanded proof, so I offered to bring animal control through every cage behind his kitchen. His workers stopped moving. The butcher grabbed my shirt instead, so I broke his grip, kicked him in the stomach, and put him on the floor. One worker slid the cage keys closer while the other decided the butcher didn't pay enough for this. I asked whether he wanted the inspection or assault report first. Pain taught him manners. The butcher unlocked the cage, surrendered the dog for free, and apologized while breathing hurt. His own attack had cost him the future Storm King. The dog followed me outside, rejected jet, and approved volt. Before I started the car, he put one paw on my leg. The cage was behind him. Following me was loyalty. At the Cedar Ridge Estates gate, I spotted the guard who died protecting me in my first life. I invited him to dinner, but his mother's bad tattoo and police record rule made the future human tank decline, so I learned his schedule and promised I'd ask again. At home, I bathed Volt, paid him 3 steaks, and mapped a household where power, courage, loyalty, and useful skill earned a place. By morning, batons, armor, generators, and medical supplies clogged my driveway. Jerky settled Volt's fear of the batons until I cracked one against steel and sent him behind the kitchen island. Early zombies stalled under enough voltage, batteries died, and redundancy looked attractive when teeth were involved. My $1 billion had solved almost every practical problem except one. I couldn't cook without creating another emergency. So that afternoon, Sophie Bennett, my sharp-eyed cooking instructor, arrived. She was gorgeous and serious about my knives. One question about knife control woke her curiosity, and one touch of the pan proved the lesson was necessary. I flooded it with oil, confused brown sugar with salt, and turned the glaze into paint remover. Sophie confiscated the spoon after 12 seconds. She asked whether I wanted lessons or company. I pointed at Volt and told her, "Ask the quality inspector." Volt sniffed the ribs, looked at me, and walked away from meat. This dog had eaten jerky from a shipping crate that morning, yet my ribs made him choose hunger. Sophie laughed until she braced against the counter, then looked at me properly. She'd expected a spoiled client hunting for attention. Instead, she found a strange, handsome man accepting criticism while his dog delivered the harsher review. Curiosity beat professional distance before the plate cooled. Once she recovered, Sophie asked why 6 spice cases were unopened and every cabinet held restaurant quantities. I told her I hated running out. She glanced around the oversized kitchen and decided I'd either survived the famine or planned Lakebridge's strangest wedding. I let her keep that theory because it was still easier than explaining zombies. Then Sophie asked the question beneath the joke, why would a man with my money bother learning to cook when he could hire a full staff? I told her money could buy ingredients and labor, but it couldn't make me useful when the person I depended on disappeared. That answer landed heavier than the ruined ribs. Sophie didn't know about the dead world or the empty radio channels, yet she heard enough loneliness to stop treating a lesson like rich guy entertainment. She cleared the pan, handed me a clean spoon, and made me begin again. This time I followed every instruction, mostly because Sophie had taken control of the counter and stood close enough to correct my wrist before I ruined anything. Her perfume reached me right as she leaned over the pan, and look, I was trying to learn. The problem was that the instructor had become the hardest part of the lesson. Sophie caught me looking in the reflection of the range hood. She asked whether I was watching the glaze or watching her. I told her, I'm trying very hard to do both. She moved the spoon back toward the pan and warned that multitasking had already destroyed 1 rack of ribs. The smile at the corner of her mouth ruined the authority she was aiming for, but I obeyed anyway because flirting worked better when dinner survived it. Volt watched the entire exchange from beside the island. When I reached for extra sauce, Sophie tapped my hand away before I touched the bottle, and Volt sat straighter like he had finally found competent management. My own dog had changed apartments in under an hour. The second glaze thickened without smoking, the ribs came out edible, and Sophie made me wait before cutting them because patience was part of cooking. I handled that rule worse than the knife. Volt sniffed the finished plate, looked at Sophie for permission, then took 1 bite and chewed slowly while staring at me. He made me wait 3 full seconds before accepting the rest because quality inspectors believed in workplace revenge. Sophie handed me the knife and tested whether the first disaster had been arrogance or ignorance. I trimmed the next rack exactly as shown, kept my fingers where she'd placed them, and earned 1 approving nod. That tiny nod felt more satisfying than it should have, which told me the attraction problem was becoming mutual trouble. She asked whether I always ignored instructions with that much confidence. I told her only when an attractive professional was standing close enough to rescue the result. Sophie rolled her eyes, but the smile stayed, and she asked whether I flirted with every instructor who prevented property damage. I told her I'd need more instructors before the sample size meant anything. She laughed again, then moved the good plate beside Volt and the ruined plate in front of me. The dog immediately chose her side of the counter. By then, Sophie saw a strange, handsome man who took corrections seriously, prepared for absences he wouldn't explain, and genuinely wanted her skill. She still planned to keep things professional, but she'd already booked another excuse to see me. Sophie told me I needed at least a month of lessons, then booked the next session before I could pretend 1 edible plate had taught me humility. Her homework was simple: repeat the glaze without freelancing, keep Volt in the room as quality control, and send her a photo before I ate anything unsupervised. I promised 2 of those things. At the door, Sophie warned me that changing the recipe again would void her professional responsibility. Volt barked once from the kitchen, fully supporting the clause. She left smiling and checked her phone twice before reaching the driveway. Outside, Sophie sat in her car with the lesson calendar open and told herself the extra booking was professional concern. I clearly needed supervision, the dog had standards, and another ruined meal could become a neighborhood hazard. Then she replayed the range hood flirt, caught herself smiling again, and moved my next lesson into the first open slot anyway. She kept the professional label and the earliest appointment. Inside, Volt waited beside the door until her car left, then returned to the good ribs and ignored the ruined plate. My household had gained a future powerhouse dog, while my kitchen had already chosen its future chef. The only person still pretending this was a normal cooking arrangement was Sophie, and even she had checked the booking twice. I checked mine and saw 26 days remaining. So I booked every lesson she'd give me, stored the ruined ribs where even time couldn't improve them, and looked at the people still outside my reach. Volt was safe, the future human tank was close, and Sophie had entered my orbit. But the 2 sisters were still somewhere in Lakebridge, my uncle was still smiling behind my father's desk, and the clock had already started eating the only peaceful days we had left. 5 days before the outbreak, the countdown had already turned every ordinary face in Lakebridge into a future question. So when I saw two sisters leaving a grocery store together, I stopped because both of them had become legends in my first life. The older sister was Megan Beaumont, a sharp-eyed woman with the posture of someone who already expected trouble. She was striking, and she knew exactly how many people were looking, but the important part was the way she kept Lucy on the inside of the sidewalk without thinking. She'd awakened fire, climbed through battle after battle, and eventually become known as the Scarlet Queen. Beside her walked Lucy Beaumont, Megan's younger sister, carrying 2 bags and apologizing to a clerk who had bumped into her. Lucy had a softer smile, and the kind of face that made strangers volunteer information, which would later become almost as dangerous as her power. She'd awakened support and healing so rare that survivors whispered she might even reach resurrection. That last part was still rumor, and rumors didn't earn a place in my house. What mattered was that both sisters were capable, loyal to each other, and still alive early enough for me to reach them. I watched Megan take the heavier bag from Lucy without asking, while Lucy slipped a candy bar into Megan's coat pocket because she knew her sister skipped meals. Their relationship explained more than any future title. They protected each other before powers, food, or status entered the equation. So I called Gavin Rhodes, the finder who had located Volt, and told him to learn where the sisters lived, what they ate, and whether anyone dangerous was already circling them. Gavin paused because my survival intelligence operation had become a dating app run by a prepper. Gavin asked whether I really needed their favorite foods too, and I told him those were the most important part. Food would become political power after the outbreak, and I intended to campaign aggressively. With 5 days remaining, Gavin delivered 2 useful lines and looked relieved when I told him I had no more assignments. Megan loved spicy Cajun food and green grapes. Lucy loved sticky barbecue ribs and watermelon. Gavin also confirmed the sisters lived together and had no powerful protector around them yet, which meant another faction hadn't reached them first. He sounded relieved when I stopped asking questions. Locating a future Storm King had been normal compared with explaining why green grapes might decide an apocalypse alliance. I stored the information, then returned to Cedar Ridge Estates because armor and weapons only mattered once somebody could use them under pressure. The guard's alloy suit was waiting in my garage, reinforced around the neck and forearms for a man whose body would soon become much stronger. I had the technician widen the shoulders and add quick-release straps because awakened strength was useless if the guard became trapped inside his own armor. Volt sniffed it, decided it was too large for him, and immediately lost interest. The technician kept glancing between the dog, the armor, and the baton crates, and privately concluded rich people had finally become too rich to understand. I tested a high-voltage baton against a hanging tire. The first strike cracked through the rubber and made the garage lights flicker. Early zombies could ignore pain, but enough electricity interrupted their movement, which meant one clean shock could create the opening for a killing blow. The rule was simple: if I missed the point between the eyebrows, the zombie kept coming. If the baton died, I needed another weapon before its teeth reached my armor. So I packed duplicates and treated every battery like it had already betrayed me once. 3 days before the deadline, I bought a refrigerated heavy truck from a desperate distributor and drove it directly into my subspace. The salesman watched a billion-dollar heir pay cash for an industrial vehicle and assumed I was opening a food company. Before I left, he offered me a second truck at a discount and asked whether I needed branded decals. I told him blank steel would age better. He was wrong about the company, but technically the apocalypse would make me Lakebridge's largest private grocery business. The purchase looked ridiculous now. Later, that truck would turn a locked industrial gate and several hundred zombies into one loud entrance. That night, I lay awake listening to normal traffic outside the mansion. For the first time since waking, I wondered whether my return had changed the timeline enough to stop the outbreak. I wanted that possibility more than I wanted revenge, power, or the money I had burned. If 9 o'clock arrived and people simply went to work, I'd gladly become the idiot who lost billions buying food nobody needed. But the last morning came, and 1 hour and 20 minutes before the outbreak, the city still looked exactly as I remembered. With 1 hour and 20 minutes left, I called my uncle, Raymond Sterling. My uncle answered from his office, still convinced the pork market explanation proved I was unstable. I offered him a new opportunity, a $500 million loan for a virtual currency investment secured by my enormous meat inventory. The numbers were absurd on purpose. Greed had to overpower suspicion, and Raymond had spent his whole life losing that fight. I also promised his spoiled son Chase Sterling a limited-run supercar if the investment paid. Chase was already browsing one on his phone, with a collector watch open in the next tab, because the supercar parasite had mentally spent the money before Raymond agreed to lend it. He messaged the dealership for color options, told 2 friends he might have a surprise by the weekend, and then pressured Raymond harder because backing out would now embarrass him. Chase could turn an imaginary purchase into a real family emergency within 6 minutes. Meanwhile, Raymond heard the trap in my voice but couldn't identify it. He knew I wanted something. He also believed any scheme designed by his supposedly broken nephew could still be controlled inside his own house. I told him I was coming over to discuss the collateral in person. On the drive to Raymond's home, I left Volt in the armored truck because I needed the house to feel safe and ordinary. Then I stopped at the Cedar Ridge Estates gate, where Troy was starting his shift. Troy, the sheltered guard who would become my human tank, looked confused when I told him to be especially careful at 9 o'clock. I couldn't mention regression, zombies, or his future death without sounding insane, so I made the warning concrete. At 9, lock the gatehouse door, stay away from anyone acting sick, and do not let anyone bite you. Troy stared at me before answering that avoiding bites had already been part of his plan. I told him to upgrade it from a preference to a rule. He wanted an explanation, but he also remembered the armor fitting and the strange urgency in my voice. So he agreed, checked the clock, and decided one ridiculous warning was worth following if it kept his employer from returning with another truck of batons. Would you still take the loan after that warning? Chase would, because the imaginary supercar had already replaced caution in his head. Back at Raymond's house, he was pacing beside the dining room and pressuring his father to say yes before I changed my mind. Raymond listed every reason the deal was suspicious. Chase answered each concern with the price of the supercar, the resale value of the watch, and the fact that my meat inventory could be seized if I failed. The boy treated his father's hesitation like a personal attack on luxury, so greed won the family vote. I arrived with minutes left before 9 o'clock. The air conditioning had every window sealed, the television was muted, and nobody inside could hear Lakebridge beginning to break beyond the walls. Chase greeted me like a beloved cousin for the first time in years. He hugged me, showed me the supercar on his phone, and asked whether red or black would look more expensive. He even pulled out a dining chair for me, which was more courtesy than he had shown during the previous decade. Meanwhile, he was already imagining the photos, the jealous friends, and the women who would suddenly discover his personality. Raymond noticed the performance and hated it, because Chase's greed made him feel his own son was dragging him into the trap. I told him black hid poor decisions better. Raymond watched the exchange without smiling. He still sensed danger, but every door was locked, his staff was nearby, and I had arrived alone. In his mind, the house belonged to him, the company belonged to him, and so did the nephew sitting at his table. At exactly 9 o'clock, something heavy struck the housekeeper's bedroom door. The sound killed every casual thought in the room. Outside, phones began vibrating with emergency alerts, cars struck each other at the intersection, and someone screamed beyond the sealed windows. Raymond's security system registered 3 open alarms at once, but he ignored the screen because the danger inside his hallway had already become personal. Chase still held the supercar page in one hand. 5 minutes earlier, that image had been his future. Now he couldn't look away from the bedroom door. Raymond called for the housekeeper, and another impact answered, followed by a wet scrape against the wood. Chase lowered his phone, annoyed before he became afraid, and Raymond ordered him to check because fathers like Raymond always found courage in other people's bodies. I walked with them down the hallway, keeping my baton hidden beneath my jacket. Chase reached the bedroom first and cracked the door open. The housekeeper lunged through the gap with gray skin, clouded eyes, and blood across her mouth. She had become the first zombie inside Raymond's house, exactly on schedule. Chase screamed and tried to slam the door. I caught it with one hand and drove the baton into his side with the other. His muscles locked as the door opened wider. The zombie crashed into him, bit through his shoulder, and dragged him against the wall while Raymond shouted my name. Raymond rushed forward to pull his son free, so I shocked him too and watched the family patriarch drop beside the dining room rug he had imported to impress people. For 27 days I had protected this exact setup. I gathered them in that house so the new world could become the instrument, and the baton only kept the door open. Chase begged me to save him. He offered the supercar he didn't own, the watch he hadn't bought, and every share his father had promised him. He could still speak, but the bite had already begun darkening the veins around his neck, and early bites had no cure. His hands were losing strength, his teeth were grinding without his control, and even Raymond could see that his emergency son was becoming something he could no longer bargain for. I dragged Raymond away from the zombie, shocked the infected housekeeper long enough to stop her, and used a lower charge to wake him. He opened his eyes to Chase crying on the floor and understood that I had complete control over who moved. Raymond promised me money first because money was the only language he trusted. When that failed, he promised the company and swore he had always planned to return my inheritance. After that came family, my father, the police, and every old authority he had used to keep me obedient. Each offer arrived weaker than the one before it, and he knew it. I asked the only question that still mattered: why did you kill my parents? His face changed because the caring uncle performance had finally run out of room. Raymond admitted taking their shares. He claimed my father had humiliated him by offering only 10%, as if a stake worth billions were pocket change. But he refused to confess the crash. Instead, he pointed at Chase and demanded that I save his son before discussing old accusations. Chase was already turning, and Raymond knew it, but entitlement had survived even when civilization hadn't. I looked at the man my father had trusted. My parents gave Raymond wealth, status, and a place inside the company. He answered by arranging their deaths and raising me beneath the stolen result. There wasn't anything funny left in the room. I told Raymond that 10% of my father's work had been generosity, and stealing the rest had never made him an owner. It had made him a parasite with a nicer office. Raymond cursed my father for keeping control. I hit him once, hard enough to stop the sentence, because that was the only part of the confrontation I still wanted for myself. Then I opened the bedroom door completely and threw him toward the infected housekeeper and his turning son. Raymond clawed at the floor, shouted that I owed him, and reached for the nephew he had spent years treating as property. I stepped back and let the new world reject his claim. This was the last thing I could still do for my parents. I closed the hallway door after the screaming stopped, stood there for one breath, and left the grief where it belonged. The murderer was gone, but the apocalypse was only beginning. As I reached the front entrance, another zombie stumbled through the broken glass outside, and a faint transparent crystal glimmered beneath the skin between its eyebrows. My old rank hadn't returned. Outside, the city was filling with infected people faster than any one man could clear them, and every minute made the next fight harder. So, I raised the baton, because the first bill after revenge was power. The zombie outside Raymond's house carried exactly what I needed next, a transparent core beneath the skin between its eyebrows. So I shocked its legs with the baton, stepped past its reaching hands, and drove my sword through the weak point. The body dropped, because the strike destroyed the 1 point early zombies couldn't survive. They kept moving through ordinary injuries, but breaking that crystal-bearing weak point ended them. The crystal growing there stored the energy behind the awakening rank system, and absorbing enough compatible cores would rebuild the power I had lost. I cut the core free, wiped it clean, and held my first piece of progression in this timeline. Absorbing a core felt like cold pressure spreading through the bones behind my eyes, and the effect depended on purity rather than the number of intact pieces. Different abilities produced different colors, but I only cared about the transparent cores tied to space. The rest could still restore energy or feed allies later, so nothing useful stayed on the pavement. At rank 1, every fragment mattered. Later, weak cores would become little more than batteries, which was why early farming had to be shameless. Outside the house, Lakebridge had become a siren-filled feeding ground. I killed 3 more zombies before reaching the truck, using electricity to stall them and the sword to finish them. Volt watched from behind the armored door, ears forward, while he recalculated the man who had been ruining ribs the previous afternoon. To him, I smelled the same. I was simply much better at murder than cooking. When the streak cleared, Volt jumped down and sniffed the bodies. The blood barely bothered him. My comm did, because even an unusually intelligent dog could tell I had done this before. I scratched his neck and told him we were going home. That eased him, though he kept glancing at the baton like his new job description had gained several dangerous clauses overnight. Back at the mansion in Cedar Ridge Estates, Volt ate enough steak to make a normal dog unconscious. Then his fur rose, purple-white sparks snapped across his back, and every light in the room died at once. I recognized the awakening immediately. Volt had become a lightning user years earlier than I remembered, which confirmed his talent was ridiculous even before proper training. The problem was his first discharge. I dove behind the sofa as lightning burst from his body and scorched a line across the ceiling. Volt stood in the middle of the living room, legs locked, while electricity crawled over his fur and the air smelled burned. You'd think rescuing the future Storm King meant I was safe around him, but at that moment I was hiding behind furniture from a dog who had never used a power in his life. The surge faded without hurting him. Volt looked at the damaged ceiling, then at me, and immediately decided the ceiling had been weak already. I came out, checked his breathing, and fed him a core. His lightning steadied into smaller arcs, which meant the awakening had completed safely. Volt lifted his head with so much pride that he briefly forgot he had just tried to renovate my house through electricity. Then several apples dropped from empty air beside the kitchen island. I had stored them the previous day, and I hadn't called them out. That accidental release meant my own spatial foundation had awakened. I raised one hand toward the far wall, gathered the pressure I remembered, and released a void projectile. The invisible force punched straight through the drywall and left a clean hole into the next room. Volt looked from the wall to me, and the pride left his face. Unfortunately, the attack consumed roughly 25% of my energy. It could damage a wall, but against moving zombies it was wasteful, narrow, and too expensive to use repeatedly. So yes, I had recovered the foundation of the Void Sovereign. I also needed a nap after attacking home construction. The cost gave me a clean target. Roughly 20 effective low-grade cores would push me toward rank 2, though damaged fragments meant I'd probably collect more than that. Until then, the subspace and my old combat skill remained more useful than the flashy attack. Volt needed control too, so I taught him to gather lightning through his throat and release it forward instead of electrocuting the furniture. His first attempt produced smoke, his second made him sneeze sparks. On the third, a thick blast crossed the yard and shattered a concrete planter. He turned toward me, waiting for praise. I told him it was excellent and slightly better than the wall hole. Volt accepted this as confirmation that he was the more talented employee. An hour later, we reached a neighborhood supermarket because I needed cores, fresh supplies, and a battlefield small enough for our first coordinated run. I put on alloy armor, carried 2 batons, and gave Volt one rule: draw the zombies away, keep moving, and never let the horde surround him. He barked once, sprinted across the parking lot, and immediately discovered that tutorial missions still contained consequences. A dozen zombies followed him. Then, 20 more came through the side entrance, and Volt's confident loop around the parked cars became a desperate sprint with teeth closing behind him. He tried cutting between 2 vehicles, but a car alarm erupted beneath his paws and pulled another cluster from the pharmacy entrance. Volt had followed my rule, yet the environment changed the route, which was exactly why first missions mattered. He abandoned the narrow lane, jumped onto a hood, and used the height to keep the horde turning instead of closing. While he kept them busy, I entered through the loading doors. The shelves still held food, medicine, batteries, and bottled drinks, so I swept entire aisles into the subspace without checkout, bags, or basic respect for retail policy. The store was open, the cashier was dead, and my discount was 100%, which was the first retail policy I had enjoyed in years. I cleared the back rooms, extracted several cores from trapped zombies, and returned outside before Volt's route collapsed. A young survivor was hiding above the office ceiling, watching shelves vanish while deciding whether I was a rescuer or the world's fastest burglar. His caution had kept him alive, but it hadn't proved courage, loyalty, or usefulness. Outside, Volt had lured the horde exactly as ordered, but a falling cart blocked his turn, and 3 zombies cut him off. I pulled a baton from the subspace, hit the closest zombie through the jaw, and kicked the second beneath Volt's lightning blast. The third reached for his hind leg, so I drove my sword through its forehead and opened the lane. Volt stumbled behind me, breathing hard and furious at being rescued. I told him the first run was supposed to be ugly. He had kept 30 zombies away from the store, survived the mistake, and followed the plan long enough for me to take everything useful. His tail lifted despite himself. "You'll become the strongest dog alive," I told him, "but today, you're still learning corners." He barked at the word dog, because future kings preferred titles even before earning them. The same young survivor climbed down after the horde moved and assumed proximity to power counted as a qualification. He offered to partner with me, promised he'd learn fast, and kept glancing at the full truck as if he already owned a seat. Meanwhile, he had no weapon, no plan, and no intention of taking the next risk himself. He wanted protection first, and usefulness later. I refused because my household needed people who brought courage, loyalty, competence, or future value. Asking nicely earned nothing by itself. A stranger who waited for someone else to clear the street had shown none of them. He called me selfish, so I left him enough distance to reconsider that opinion before the next horde arrived. Our real target was an industrial cold storage facility outside the neighborhood because its meat and produce would become impossible to replace. The only access road narrowed between concrete barriers, and hundreds of zombies had packed themselves into that choke point. There was no alternate route, so I locked my helmet, gave Volt the high side, and entered the horde with both batons active. Electricity snapped through the first line while Volt struck from the flank, and every stunned body became another obstacle for the zombies behind it. One set of teeth closed on my forearm. The alloy plate held, but the impact drove me sideways and reminded me the armor protected skin, not balance. I shocked the attacker, stepped over its legs, and kept moving until my right baton died in the middle of the road. Volt's next blast cleared space on my left, but the effort made his legs shake, and we still had half the choke point ahead. The armor was holding, the dog was tiring, and every dead zombie became a wall the living ones climbed. For the first time since the outbreak began, preparation had stopped feeling excessive. The nearest zombies surged because dead equipment looked like surrender. Then I reached into empty air and pulled out the backup. You guys already know why I'd bought crates instead of one heroic weapon. Batteries die, hordes don't care about dramatic timing, and redundancy feels extremely attractive when 6 mouths are coming toward your face. The second baton cracked alive. I cleared the final cluster, Volt blasted the bodies trying to rise, and we reached the facility gate with armor scratched, energy lower, and enough cores to push my foundation into rank 2. The gate was refrigerated steel, chained from inside, and packed with zombies behind it. Fighting them one by one would waste the entire day, so I opened the subspace and drove out the heavy truck I had purchased 3 days earlier. The engine roared across an empty loading yard. Volt jumped into the passenger side, the horn blared, and I drove straight through the refrigerated gate in one brutal lane of steel, noise, and flying bodies. The reinforced windshield webbed at one corner, the front grille bent inward, and the truck still kept moving. The shortcut saved energy but spent vehicle durability instead. Volt planted both paws against the dashboard and discovered that being the Storm King's younger self didn't include enjoying my driving. Inside the facility, 3 surviving workers watched from an upper platform. The shift foreman saw the truck and thought escape, the mechanic saw my armor and thought supplies, and the lookout woman saw one man with a tired dog and thought opportunity. Gratitude lasted about 5 seconds. The foreman had controlled the keys and assumed leadership entitled him to whatever rescue arrived, while the mechanic read my scratched armor as exhaustion. Up beside them, the lookout noticed Volt's slight limp and decided the dog could be distracted. Their plan grew from real details. They simply read every detail backward. I parked beside the loading floor and killed the closest zombies while Volt guarded the ramp. The 3 workers came down smiling, thanked me for opening a path, and claimed they knew where the best stock was stored. The lookout woman stepped closer and pointed toward a side freezer. She wanted my eyes turned away while the foreman and mechanic moved behind me. I let them commit, and the 2 men grabbed my arms before demanding the truck keys. The foreman announced that the facility's supplies belonged to them, while the mechanic tightened his hold and told the woman to search me. They had watched me drive through a horde, and their conclusion was that I must be easy to rob afterward. Seriously, what kind of confidence supplement were these 3 taking? Volt lunged from the ramp, but the mechanic kicked at him, which ended any chance that I'd leave one attacker breathing. A baton appeared in my right hand directly from the subspace. The mechanic had 1 second to understand the impossible object before the charge dropped him. I broke the foreman's grip, struck his throat, and finished both men before either could turn the ambush into a fight. The lookout woman ran toward the stairs. She screamed that she had only distracted me because the men forced her, but she had chosen the plan, chosen the signal, and chosen my truck before I entered the building. Volt caught her at the landing and knocked her down. She begged me to spare her because she was a woman, but she had chosen the distraction, the signal, and the truck before I entered the building. I stunned her, finished the ambush where their gratitude performance had begun, and moved on. After that, the cold rooms belonged to me. I walked through industrial freezers stacked with beef, seafood, produce, seasonings, and enough preserved food to feed tens of thousands. The subspace swallowed shelves, pallets, hanging meat, and entire rows of sealed containers while Volt followed behind, increasingly convinced his owner had discovered a cheat code for groceries. In one room, frost still hung around suspended racks. In the next, crates of vegetables remained untouched. Farther back, sealed seafood-filled loading bays wider than my townhouse. I didn't narrate every item because we'd still be there now. The important part was that each disappearing row increased both my household's future safety and the price on my head. By the time I finished, roughly 60,000 tons of food had disappeared into a place where none of it would age. That number sounds stupid because it was stupid. I had started the week as the man drivers filmed for buying too much meat. Now I privately owned enough fresh food to make every starving survivor in Lakebridge either love me, follow me, or plan my murder. The warehouse made me rich in the only currency the apocalypse respected, and it also made secrecy more dangerous. I had enough usable fragments to reach rank 2 once I absorbed them safely, but power and food created the same pressure. The more I owned, the more carefully I had to choose who saw it. After dark, I drove the truck toward Cedar Ridge Estates, and the headlights caught a young man stepping into the road with one hand hidden beneath his shirt. I thought owning enough food for a city was the hard part. Then I found Troy standing beside the one person I never wanted near him again. The young man in my headlights raised one hand for help, while the other gripped a metal rod beneath his shirt. The road behind him was clear, so I told him the cab was full, and slowed just enough to make his choice obvious. He exposed the rod, threatened revenge, and stepped closer because he thought fear would stop the truck. I'd already lived through the version where small hostile men awakened into large hostile problems, so I pointed at him and told Volt this was another butcher who wanted dog meat. Volt knew I'd invented that charge. He attacked anyway. The rod missed, one lightning blast dropped the man, and the idiot kept promising revenge while crawling toward the ditch. That answered the only useful question, so Volt finished the threat and climbed back into the truck, looking like an employee documenting management dishonesty. At Cedar Ridge Estates, Volt drew the zombies away long enough for me to park, then circled them back around the refrigerated truck as free security. Anyone trying to steal it now had to cross an unpaid patrol with no lunch breaks. Then I used the truck speaker to call for Troy. Curtains moved, a side door opened, and Troy Maddox emerged alive with a fire axe in one hand and Dana Foster behind him. He was alive, and for 1 second the mask came off. Troy had died for me once, and seeing him walk toward the truck with both hands attached felt better than every ton of food in my subspace. He had followed the 9 o'clock warning, locked the gatehouse when the first sick resident attacked, and fought his way through the service lane with that axe. My strange instruction had bought him the first 10 minutes, and Troy had used them well. Volt approached first, sniffed the blood on Troy's torn vest, and sat beside his left boot without growling. Troy waited for permission before touching him, then rested 2 fingers behind Volt's ear instead of grabbing at the future Storm King like an ordinary pet. The dog leaned into the contact once and immediately pretended it hadn't happened. That was enough. One loyal idiot had recognized another, and my household had gained its first friendship before either of them admitted it. Troy even apologized for refusing dinner before the outbreak, as if social caution had caused the zombies. I told him his mother's bad tattoo theory had aged better than most emergency plans. He laughed once, then shifted so Dana stayed behind his shoulder when another infected body wandered into view. That reflex was exactly the problem. Even exhausted, he was still spending himself first. Dana noticed the armored truck, Volt's lightning, and the fact that Troy trusted me before she knew my name. She immediately decided staying attached to him was the safest route into whatever I owned. I kept my face calm because warning Troy would only make him defend her. Her next choice needed to expose her without my memories doing the work. The woman beside him was Dana Foster, a survivor I remembered far too well. Dana had spent the first apocalypse moving from protector to protector while hiding her own food, and Troy's loyalty made him her favorite target. She once convinced him to surrender medicine she had already stolen for herself. Another time, she sent us into a dangerous store because she claimed she hadn't eaten, then opened a private stash after we nearly died. This timeline hadn't shown Troy any of that, so I couldn't order him to hate her because of memories only I possessed. I invited Troy to the mansion and let Dana follow. Inside the entry hall, Dana pressed close to Troy, thanked me with a frightened smile, and explained that she had eaten nothing since morning. She kept one hand around his arm while her eyes tracked the locked pantry, the armor crates, and the heavy truck outside. Troy immediately offered her the last snack from his pocket. Dana accepted it before finishing the sentence about how guilty she felt taking from him. Volt walked behind her, sniffed once, and bit the bottom of her shoulder bag. The fabric tore, and protein bars, crackers, canned meat, candy, and 2 drink bottles scattered across my floor. Dana slapped at Volt and accused him of attacking her. Troy looked down at enough food to last several days, then looked at the snack still open in his hand. Meanwhile, Dana was already rebuilding the lie. She decided the food had to be reserved for emergencies, that she had been afraid Troy would waste it, and that a helpless woman performance might still keep him apologizing. Troy wanted to believe her. His instinct to reach for the kind explanation first was both his weakness and one reason I trusted him. Dana claimed she had hidden the bag because strangers stole from women during disasters. Troy asked why she had begged for his food while carrying her own. She answered by crying, grabbing his sleeve, and reminding him that he had promised to protect her. When Troy reached for one of the fallen protein bars, Dana slapped his hand and called the stash hers. That tiny reflex exposed more than the entire speech. She wanted his food shared and her food protected. The spilled food exposed Dana's first lie, while Troy's sympathy still kept the rest of her performance alive. So I gave her a choice she couldn't explain away. I sent Volt outside to bring several zombies toward the mansion. He looked back twice because most dogs were trained to keep danger away from home, and his owner had just assigned the worst side quest in canine history. While he worked, I crushed garlic into one bowl of strong-smelling liquid. There was enough to spread 2 thin coats, one for Dana and one for Troy. I told them garlic repelled zombies. Dana's eyes locked onto the bowl. Troy asked how certain I was, and I said certain enough to stand beside them when the swarm arrived. I placed the bowl between them and stepped back, because touching it first had to be their decision. Troy looked toward Dana before reaching, already planning to give her the thicker coat. Dana saw that hesitation and understood she could take everything without a fight. So what would you do with a bowl big enough for 2? Dana believed it was protection, knew it could be shared, and expected Troy to surrender his portion if she demanded loudly enough. Volt barked outside as the first zombie entered the street. Troy reached for the bowl and suggested they divide it. Dana snatched it from my hands, dumped every drop across her clothes, and rubbed the liquid into her sleeves before Troy could stop her. She did not leave him a spoonful. Dana's choice told Troy more than any speech I could have given. Troy lowered his empty hands and finally saw the calculation beneath her fear. If the garlic worked, she intended to live while he stood beside her unprotected. Dana noticed his face and immediately claimed she had panicked. She promised to stand in front, insisted the smell would cover both of them, and reached for him again. Troy stepped away, and when Dana reached again, he removed her hand without raising his voice. She had expected anger because anger could be manipulated. The quiet refusal frightened her more. Troy had spent the whole morning placing his body between Dana and danger. Now, with danger approaching, she had made clear that his body was still the shield, and hers was the life worth saving. Troy had witnessed the choice himself, so there wasn't anything left for Dana to explain away. Then the zombies turned toward the mansion and accelerated directly toward Dana. Dana's relief vanished when the zombies kept coming. As she demanded to know why they weren't avoiding her, I opened the subspace long enough to retrieve armor, a baton, and Troy's reinforced suit. Garlic did not repel zombies, its odor attracted them. Dana stared at the equipment appearing from empty air, understood I had controlled the entire test, and switched tactics one final time. She softened her voice, opened her jacket at the collar, and offered to make me very happy if I protected her instead. The offer was desperate, adult, and still useless. She had mistaken attraction for leverage after proving she'd sacrificed the man who saved her. I told her to keep the jacket closed, the zombies didn't need encouragement. Troy put on the armor, but he didn't move toward her. Dana screamed his name, accused him of abandoning her, and tried to wipe the garlic away with her bare hands. The smell had soaked through the fabric. The swarm reached the driveway before Dana found another argument. I pulled Troy behind the armored door while Dana ran toward the street, drawing every infected body after her. She begged until the first zombie caught her, and Troy watched the person he had protected choose herself all the way to the end. I didn't prolong it, explain survival ethics, or ask him to thank me. Dana had written the result when she took the whole bowl. After the swarm moved past, Troy stood beside me in silence. He was angry at her, angry at himself, and relieved that the truth had arrived before he died for it. Volt sat near his boot without demanding attention, and Troy rested one armored hand on the dog's head. The two of them had barely met, yet both understood that loyalty without judgment could get someone killed. Then more zombies pressed against the gate because I had deliberately brought them home, which was the bill for staging the test. Troy gripped the axe while I handed him the reinforced suit's helmet, pulled another baton from the subspace, and told him we'd clear the property together. By the time the last body stopped moving, the driveway was wrecked, the entry hall was covered in blood, Volt had tracked half the mess through the kitchen, and my growing household had officially exceeded my domestic competence. Troy was alive and finally free of Dana. He also stopped asking whether he should leave, took the spare gate key from my hand, and began checking the windows like the mansion already belonged to his responsibility. But the house now looked like the apocalypse had held a private event inside it. I stared at the ruined kitchen, remembered Sophie's number, and realized the next person I needed was the woman who had already proven she could save my meals. The morning after Dana's choice, Troy stood in my ruined entry hall while Volt wore a towel harness and dragged a mop behind him. The future Storm King had survived lightning, zombies, and human ambushes, yet household cleanup was already breaking his spirit. Troy handled the bodies outside because his strength had awakened during the final clear. One moment the gate pinned him, the next he shoved it open with one arm. He treated the power like a useful tool, then carried two corpses at once while Volt realized the human employee had become dangerous competition. I assigned Volt blood removal. He looked at the towel harness, looked at Troy, and filed a silent complaint with nobody. Our domestic system was now one billionaire, one security guard, and one legendary dog arguing over a mop, so Sophie's absence had become physically obvious. Before searching for her, I showed Troy what he'd joined. I closed the doors and pulled a hot breakfast, clean water, armor, and a replacement table from empty air. Troy stopped pretending the previous night had been adrenaline. I told him my awakening included a vast private storage space where time stopped for supplies. The space was finite, and I'd never placed a living person inside. I kept regression and the future to myself. Troy only needed the truth steaming on the table. He asked the useful questions first. Did food spoil? Could weapons come out instantly? And could the space carry people? I gave him the limits without the history. Troy understood that knowing this secret made walking away dangerous, then set his axe beside the chair facing the door anyway. He didn't swear loyalty or ask for a title. He chose the seat that could see every entrance and made himself part of the house. Volt stared at my steak like executive compensation remained unequal. Troy hadn't seen fresh eggs, hot bread, and chilled juice since the outbreak, so one bite ended the practical debate. He didn't make a speech, he just slid the extra plate toward Volt when he thought I wasn't looking. After breakfast, I absorbed 42 damaged and low-grade fragments, roughly equal to 20 intact cores. The last usable piece pushed me into Awakening Rank 2, and transparent energy gathered along my hand as I formed a narrow void sword. It lasted 5 seconds. I tested the blade against a steel practice plate, and the transparent edge opened it before disappearing from my hand. Troy checked the cut, then checked me, because no ordinary weapon had made a sound. Volt walked around the plate, sniffed both halves, and looked offended that management had acquired another trick. 5 seconds was enough to end one early fight if I chose the moment correctly, which was already years ahead of my first timeline. The next morning, Troy tested his new strength inside the reinforced armor I'd ordered for him, while Volt received a smaller harness and demanded to know why the human equipment looked better. Troy told him humans didn't leave surprises on the lawn. Volt stared at Troy's boots and began considering a targeted response. The usefulness rivalry was officially mutual. Once the house was secure, we drove to a grain facility on Lakebridge's edge. 60,000 tons of cold storage food made me rich, but basic calories would keep a future survivor group alive. We drove through a loose cluster of zombies at the entrance and reached the warehouse without serious resistance. That should have made the raid easy. Instead, the loading floor was silent. The facility had employed dozens of workers, yet no bodies blocked the aisles and no survivors answered our calls. Half-eaten lunches remained on a break room table, and a radio repeated the same emergency message beside an empty chair. A forklift sat pressed against a wall until its battery died, while drag marks disappeared behind a basement door. The empty floor gave us one ugly answer: whatever attacked had arrived fast enough that nobody reached the main exit. The question was obvious: if the zombies were outside, what had emptied the building from within? Troy opened the basement door. Volt lowered his head and growled. I led them down because the grain remained valuable, but I kept the 5-second sword ready in my mind and ordered both of them to retreat at the first sign of a swarm. At the bottom, Troy's flashlight crossed a human skull stripped nearly clean. The marks around it were small and numerous. Scratching moved through the pipes above us, then stopped whenever the flashlight stopped. Troy shifted beside the stairs so his armored body covered the retreat, while Volt's fur rose before the first shape appeared. The facility hadn't been abandoned, something had cleaned it out. Rats poured from the darkness before I finished the warning. They climbed the stairs, walls, and pipes in a moving mass, forcing us backward into the loading bay. Volt released lightning across the floor while Troy used a metal bar to sweep whole clusters away, but more kept coming through the basement opening. A wave tried circling behind the conveyor line, so I dropped a steel storage rack from the subspace and blocked the gap. More rats climbed the hanging cables, forcing Volt to angle lightning upward while Troy guarded his blind side. The swarm wasn't individually strong, its pressure came from never giving us one clean second. I threw sealed food from the subspace toward the far corner. The smell redirected part of the swarm, buying us room, but the largest shape stayed beneath the stairs. Then the Rat King emerged. It was larger than a wolf, scarred across the snout, and already carrying the pressure of a rank 3 or rank 4 mutant. Early mutants could burn through their own life force for explosive growth, which made them powerful now and dead much sooner. That future limit wouldn't help if it crushed us today. The Rat King studied the three of us and chose me first. I looked lighter than armored Troy and less dangerous than the sparking dog, so the animal treated me as the easiest prey. I met its first rush with a live baton. The charge snapped across its jaw, burned a strip of fur, and accomplished one useful thing: it proved our early zombie equipment had reached its ceiling. The mutant bit through the baton's guard, tore it from my hand, and shook the broken weapon aside while the smaller rats surged around my boots. Volt blasted the swarm off me, but the wide discharge made his rear legs shake, and Troy had to step between us before the animal charged again. It crossed the floor faster than I expected and hit my chest hard enough to knock me onto the concrete. My helmet struck first, the armor absorbed the claws, and the impact still emptied my lungs. The mutant had read my posture correctly. I was the tactician, but my current body remained the weakest frame in the room, and another clean hit could kill me. Troy grabbed the mutant from the side before its teeth reached my throat. Volt blasted its hind leg, and together they forced it away, but the Rat King shifted targets immediately. It struck Troy's armor with both claws. Metal tore open along his shoulder. Troy drove one fist into its ribs, but the Rat King absorbed the hit and slammed him against a support beam. Volt attacked from the side, forcing the mutant to turn, yet smaller rats swarmed his paws and broke the angle. The second claw strike buckled Troy's chest plate, and his knees dropped under the pressure. The armor that had stopped zombie bites was failing, and if the next strike reached the gap, Troy would die protecting me again. I emptied 2 sacks of meat scraps across the floor. The smaller rats broke formation and swarmed the food, clearing a narrow lane between me and the mutant. The Rat King saw the short metal handle in my hand and mistook it for another baton. It grinned, pressed Troy down, and committed its weight to the killing strike. So I formed the Void Sword. Transparent force extended from the handle, and the Rat King's confidence died the instant it recognized spatial energy. It abandoned Troy and tried to flee toward the basement. 5 seconds had already started. I crossed the lane, cut through one rear leg, and drove the blade through its skull before the weapon disappeared. The mutant twisted at the last instant, so the first cut missed the core and forced me closer. Volt blasted its face. Troy caught the damaged leg and their 2-second opening. Let me finish the strike. The mutant collapsed beside the stairwell with 1 second left on my control. Volt stopped firing, while Troy rolled free and checked the torn armor twice because both of them understood how close the fight had come. I pulled him upright, and the torn shoulder plate fell away in his hand. Volt shoved his head beneath Troy's uninjured arm, angry at the boss for nearly taking the human employee he'd spent all week competing with. That fight was too close, and all 3 of us knew it. The Rat King carried a core several times larger than an ordinary zombie's, so I stored it for the day. Common fragments stopped advancing me and removed 2 long fangs for future weapons. Every greedy instinct wanted the core immediately, but absorbing boss energy while exhausted was how people cooked their own brains. Troy asked how valuable it was. I told him nobody outside our house could learn it existed, and he nodded once. Then he handed me one broken armor plate instead of making a loyalty speech. The claw marks almost reached the lining, so the rare loot came with a clean reminder. One stronger mutant had nearly repeated his first life death. We cleared the remaining rats, then I opened the subspace across the loading floor. Packaged sacks vanished first, followed by sealed pallets and the contents of the silos, until every footstep echoed through a building that had been full minutes earlier. Troy watched enough basic food disappear to support thousands and finally understood why secrecy mattered as much as armor. Volt just sniffed the empty floor and looked disappointed that none of it was steak. Then, the power failed. On the way out, Troy found 2 claw marks within an inch of skin, while Volt stayed pressed against his damaged armor. We left with grain, rare loot, and proof that our supplies had outgrown our strength. For 3 days, we trained near the estate. Troy learned to hold his footing under a charging frame, Volt cut his lightning into controlled bursts, and I absorbed common cores until rank 3 stabilized. The clean before and after was my void sword. 5 seconds before the rat fight, 20 seconds after training. Troy timed it once and stopped pretending my growth rate was normal. By the second day, Troy could stop the loaded frame without sliding, and Volt could hit 3 targets before his legs shook. The dog fired one especially clean blast, turned toward us for praise, and found Troy still staring at my 20-second sword. Volt's tail lowered. Even apocalypse training could create workplace jealousy. On the 3rd evening, Volt returned from what he believed was important combat training with sparks snapping around his ears. I praised his discipline, handed him 2 trash bags, and pointed toward the curb. He dragged one bag across Troy's boots on the way out, because the usefulness rivalry had become fully reciprocal. The next morning, with rank 3 stable and the household barely functional, I entered Sophie Bennett's number into the truck navigation. Her last known location was a hotel dormitory across the city, and I was about to find out whether the woman who had laughed at my ribs had survived people far uglier than zombies. The next morning, Troy, Volt, and I crossed Lakebridge toward the hotel dormitory where Sophie Bennett had been staying before the outbreak. The Rat King had taught us what happened when useful people remained outside too long, so finding the woman who could save our kitchen had become a rescue mission. At the dormitory entrance, a hotel waiter watched us clear 3 zombies and immediately offered directions in exchange for protection. He knew Sophie's name because she had kept his group alive during the first days. Sophie had unlocked a service corridor when the main lobby collapsed. She held the fire door while strangers ran through, pulled the waiter inside by his jacket, and gave the survivors her last stocked room. After that, she divided the food, cooked every remaining ingredient into meals that stretched farther than they should have, and slept beside the door so the frightened guests could use the beds. Nobody objected while her supplies lasted. Meanwhile, the people she saved were deciding she had become expensive. The hotel socialite wanted control of the food, the wealthy investor backing her wanted one fewer mouth, and the hotel manager wanted somebody weaker to sacrifice so his authority still looked useful. Their guards wanted the easier order. First, the socialite accused Sophie of stealing portions while Sophie was cooking for everyone. She slapped the serving spoon from Sophie's hand and called her a servant who had forgotten her place. Then the investor counted the remaining cans, announced that one fewer person meant 2 extra days for him, and voted to remove the woman who had fed him. Finally, the manager ordered 2 guards to drag Sophie through the service door, while the remaining survivors watched from behind the lock. He kept calling it a necessary decision because cowardice sounds better when somebody gives it a management title. Sophie had opened the door that saved them, fed them from her own supplies, and now those same cowards were beating her toward a horde because they had finished eating. The waiter pointed down the service alley. I heard Sophie before I saw her. One guard shoved her onto the pavement, the door locked behind her, and several zombies turned toward the sound. I reached her first, caught her arm, and pulled her behind me as the nearest zombie lunged. Its fingers closed on the back of her jacket, so I cut the sleeve free and drove the baton beneath its jaw. Troy struck it with the reinforced bar while Volt's lightning pinned 2 more against a dumpster. A 4th zombie climbed over the loading rail, and Sophie shouted the warning before either man saw it. I formed the void sword, cut through the attacker, and kept moving until Sophie had a wall behind her and space to breathe. She was bruised, exhausted, and still trying to warn us about the people inside. Sophie had been thrown out minutes earlier, yet her first instinct was to stop strangers from trusting the same door. Her hands shook once the danger cleared, but she forced them still and checked Troy's torn sleeve before checking her own bruises. I told her I remembered the cooking lesson. She stared at my armor, then at Volt, and decided the handsome kitchen criminal had changed careers very aggressively. Once the alley was clear, Sophie gave us the short version. She had saved the group, rationed the food, and refused to let the manager lock weaker survivors outside. The socialite answered by hitting her, the investor called compassion wasteful, and the manager made the expulsion official because procedure helped cowards feel clean. Sophie looked at the locked door and said the people inside should face the same danger they had assigned to her. The service door opened before Sophie finished, and the socialite stepped outside wearing clean clothes and a grateful smile, followed by the investor, manager, guards, and several shelter residents. They saw our weapons, assumed we had come for everyone, and thanked me for rescuing the hotel group. You've got to admire the confidence. They had thrown Sophie to zombies, waited until we killed those zombies, and then walked outside like the transportation committee had arrived. The socialite introduced herself by status instead of name and offered Troy a job escorting her. She promised cash, a future executive position, and access to her family's properties once order returned. Troy looked at Sophie's bruised face, looked back at the woman who had ordered it, and punched the offer directly out of her mouth. Her designer sunglasses skidded beneath a delivery cart, and half the shelter residents stepped away before she hit the ground. Nobody helped her up once her money stopped protecting her teeth. The investor shouted that we couldn't treat important people this way. I asked what made him important now. He listed companies, properties, and people who used to answer his calls, while his phone showed no signal in his raised hand. The manager ordered the guards to remove us, but those guards had just watched Troy drop their patron with one punch and Volt burn a line into the pavement. One lowered his weapon first. The other followed because loyalty had suddenly become unpaid. I let Sophie identify exactly who had dragged her outside. Then Troy disarmed the guards, Volt kept the crowd against the wall, and I tied the socialite, investor, manager, and the men who enforced the order. Their status collapsed in public. The residents who had stayed silent inside now avoided their eyes, because nobody wanted to stand beside leaders who could no longer protect the door. Sophie watched the manager ask those same residents for help, and nobody moved. The man who had ordered her outside could no longer command a hand to untie him. The socialite tried money first. She offered a salary large enough to buy several cars before the outbreak. When I refused, she promised influence, private access, and finally, a very enthusiastic bath arrangement if I untied her. Her bargaining strategy was descending floors quickly. I told her Sophie's safety was worth more than every offer she had made. Attempted murder outweighed every suggestive offer, and the socialite had confused being desired with being indispensable. The manager demanded a fair hearing. I pointed toward the same service alley where he had sent Sophie without one. We left the 4 main betrayers tied inside the loading area with the remaining shelter residents free to decide what happened next. None of those 4 entered our lives again. Their authority was gone, the doors were no longer theirs to command, and fate had the same access they gave Sophie. The hotel waiter followed us toward the parking lot and asked to join my group. Pointing us toward the alley earned him a chance to ask, while joining our missions still required courage. I handed him a baseball bat and pointed toward 10 slow zombies beyond the fence. If he could kill them while we covered his retreat, he'd prove enough courage to continue the conversation. He had 10 enemies, 1 weapon, and a safe path back if he actually swung. All he had to supply was the willingness. He gripped the bat, counted the zombies, and returned it. Be honest. That choice didn't earn him an inner house key, though at least he was honest. I gave him a few minutes to collect supplies from the hotel and returned him to the safer side of the fence. He filled 1 backpack, thanked Sophie, and chose the dormitory door over the parking lot. That choice might keep him alive, but it didn't create a household role. I'd rather reject someone clearly than pretend dead weight became useful through optimism. Then I turned to Sophie. I offered her a secure room, food, protection, and a place in the group as our chef. Her cooking skill mattered, but so did what she had done before we arrived. She opened a route for strangers and kept feeding them until they betrayed her. Sophie asked whether the position included another private lesson. I told her only if she wanted to watch Volt reject my food again. She looked toward Volt and asked, "That bad?" Volt walked away before I could defend myself. Sophie accepted without asking for guarantees nobody could give. She only asked where the knives were and what time dinner needed to be ready. I welcomed her to the household and immediately assigned the first feast, because emotional recovery worked better when the survivor holding a knife had something productive to cut. At the mansion that evening, Sophie entered the kitchen and stopped. Fresh meat, vegetables, spices, clean water, working lights, and restaurant equipment filled a space larger than the hotel's whole service floor. Troy carried in her single bag while Volt trotted straight to his bowl, both of them acting like this strange household had been waiting for her. Sophie opened the refrigerator, saw fresh berries beside chilled cream, and closed it again just to make sure hunger hadn't created a hallucination. She understood that my offer had been real. Then she understood I had understated it. Sophie developed a sharp headache while preparing the glaze. I recognized the pre-awakening symptom and moved everyone back from the stove. She closed her eyes, focused on the heat in her hands, and produced a small orange flame above her palm. The flame was small but stable. Sophie laughed once from pure relief, then looked at me for confirmation before trusting it. I nodded and she squared her shoulders before asking how to control the heat. Sophie stared at the fire while Troy expected combat questions and Volt prepared for another ceiling incident. Her first fear was that the flame would hurt someone, so I had her hold it above a steel tray and reduce it until the heat stopped warping the air. Control came quickly because cooking had already trained her to respect temperature. Then I handed her the sauce brush. She used the controlled flame to caramelize the glaze directly across the ribs. The smell reached the dining room, and Volt immediately forgave the entire concept of human cooking. Sophie used her first controlled flame on dinner before she aimed it at anything alive. She cooked steak, vegetables, bread, and the upgraded ribs while the rest of us sat around a table that had finally stopped looking like a supply station. Volt took one bite, stared at Sophie, and moved his bowl closer to her chair. My former quality inspector had transferred loyalty through sauce. Troy laughed, Sophie relaxed, and the house gained a sound it had been missing, people enjoying food without wondering when the next meal would come. I had survived once with nobody left. I was not making Sophie pay twice for saving the wrong people. After the meal, I gave her a private bedroom, a clean phone loaded with our contact channel, fresh clothes, and a key that locked from inside. The room had clean sheets, bottled water, and one framed landscape left by the previous decorator, which Sophie immediately turned face down because the painted mountains looked judgmental. 3 useful objects carried the real message. She had space, communication, and control over her own door. Nobody could vote her outside again. Sophie ran one thumb over the phone and asked whether I rescued every chef this dramatically. Only the ones who can save my kitchen. She smiled, looked me over with considerably less professional distance than during our first lesson, and decided the room might become home faster than she expected. I was also looking, because a capable woman smiling after surviving hell deserved appreciation. The difference was that she still had the key in her hand. Sophie closed the bedroom door while blushing, and the household gained fire, food, and someone who could make both feel human. On the other side, she leaned against the wood, smiled at the new phone, and admitted to herself that safety was only half the reason her pulse had stayed high after dinner. I was downstairs pretending Volt needed another serving, which was an excellent use of tactical denial. A few days later, I gathered Troy, Volt, and Sophie beside the truck and told them the 2 future sisters were still outside. The chef was safe, but the healer was still outside, and the first thing guarding her was a cat with standards. Several days after Sophie joined us, I prepared to find the Beaumont sisters before another faction did. Before leaving, I told Sophie to keep the mansion locked unless one of us confirmed the visitor. Begging stayed outside. Injuries got a radio call, not an open door. She didn't argue after watching pity become a weapon at the hotel. Volt approved until Sophie mentioned she'd be guarding the stakes, and then executive security suddenly sounded attractive. That morning, Troy, Volt, and I swept several low-risk blocks and collected about 500 cores. Troy held the lanes, Volt drove zombies into them, and I used the Void Sword only for bottlenecks. The pile looked impressive, but low-grade fragments barely moved rank 3 anymore, so finding high-talent allies mattered more than farming the same streets forever. Then Volt and I reached the sisters' 3rd-floor apartment. The hallway door was barricaded, rappers sat near the stairs, and Volt smelled one living person inside. Lucy had stayed because Megan might return, even while her food ran out. That kind of loyalty was exactly why I wanted both sisters. Someone was home, and before I could knock, a gray cat shot from beneath a broken cabinet. Volt abandoned every ounce of discipline, chased her down the corridor, and caught the cat by the scruff near the stair landing. A furious voice entered my head. "Tell this idiot to let go." Volt froze, and I did too, though I handled it with more dignity because nobody had teeth around my neck. The cat projected language directly into nearby minds. Short range, perfectly clear, and completely absent from my first life memories. That absence mattered because I had known most early animal powerhouses, yet Pepper had never appeared in any faction report, battlefield rumor, or survivor market. Her voice answered one question and opened a much stranger one. You know what surprised me most? The talking cat ignored the collapsed city, the strange men, and the dog that had just bitten her because she wanted smoked fish first. I ordered Volt to release her. He did, then barked that she had started running first. The cat told him running from a dog was basic intelligence and introduced herself as Pepper, which was already more respectful than what she kept calling him. Volt demanded an apology for the insult. Pepper demanded payment for emotional damages. They had known each other for 30 seconds and were already negotiating like divorced business partners. Pepper smelled the smoked salmon in my subspace and sat beside my boot like we had completed negotiations. When she padded toward the far stairwell, her voice faded, confirming the mind speech only worked at short range. Then she returned to my shoe and demanded the fish again, because scientific discovery had lasted exactly as long as her appetite allowed. Meanwhile, she had calculated that I carried food, controlled Volt, and looked much harder to kill than anyone in the building. Her recruitment standards were ruthless and refreshingly honest. The apartment door opened, and Lucy Beaumont stepped into the hall wearing a bike helmet and holding a cast-iron skillet with both hands. She was Megan's younger sister, the future healer I had seen before the outbreak, but right now she was an exhausted woman protecting her cat with cookware. The helmet was crooked, but her grip was serious. Lucy told Pepper to move away from the strangers. Pepper answered inside all our heads that the strangers had fish, and one of them had already trained the dog badly enough to be useful. Volt objected, and Pepper ignored him. I introduced myself, explained that I had a safe group nearby, and offered food without stepping closer. Lucy kept the skillet raised because she had survived by distrusting convenient men, and the apocalypse had produced plenty of those. She asked how I found the apartment, why Volt understood speech, and what I wanted in return. I answered plainly. I had seen the sisters before the outbreak, knew they were capable, and wanted people who could contribute to a secure household. I left the future titles out, because telling a frightened stranger she'd become a legend was a fast way to sound dangerous. Pepper walked to my side anyway. Lucy called her back, but Pepper demanded dried fish first and then announced that she was willing to relocate, and Lucy could come if she behaved. The cat-running recruitment had entered the chat. Lucy almost laughed, which lowered the skillet by 2 inches. I gave Pepper 1 strip of smoked salmon, then let Lucy watch Volt sit before receiving his share. The animals trusted the routine, and that mattered more than promises from a stranger. Lucy finally agreed to leave the apartment long enough to gather supplies and assess our group. She strapped the helmet tighter, refused to abandon the skillet, and let Pepper climb onto her backpack with the smoked salmon strip. The cat acted like she had personally completed the negotiations. Honestly, I respected the loadout. Armor, blunt weapon, angry cat, she had built a budget adventuring party by herself. Outside, I introduced Troy as our strength user, Volt as a lightning user, and my own ability as space manipulation. I retrieved a baton from empty air so Lucy could see the rule before relying on it. She admitted her awakening felt different. Light gathered around her hands, and she described the effect as something close to a support blessing rather than a direct attack. A group of zombies came through the intersection before we could test it safely. There were 8 at first, then a delivery van alarm drew another cluster from the next block. Lucy stepped behind Troy, raised both hands, and activated the ability. Warm light crossed Troy, Volt, and me, and my strength, speed, and control rose by roughly 1/3. The boost made every correct decision hit harder and every mistake easier to survive. That exact gain surprised even me. I knew Lucy's future category, but I had never known how strong her first stage boost had been. Troy moved first and struck a zombie hard enough to throw it into a parked car. A woman watching from an upstairs window saw one ordinary-looking guard move like heavy machinery and pulled her child away from the glass. Volt's lightning widened without losing shape, and Pepper stopped insulting him long enough to notice. My void sword formed faster and held steadier, which meant Lucy had strengthened power control as well as muscle. Lucy watched the 3 of us change because of her and stopped thinking of herself as baggage. The zombies fell quickly, and then Lucy looked at one remaining infected woman near a bus stop and told me she wanted to kill it herself. I offered to weaken the target, but Lucy refused. Lucy had spent days waiting behind a door for Megan to return, and she knew that safety without competence could disappear the moment somebody stronger left. So she took an iron rod from Troy, kept the skillet strapped to her pack, and approached while we covered every exit. The zombie lunged before anybody could lighten the moment. Lucy stepped too early, recovered, and drove the rod into its shoulder. The blow didn't stop it, and its nails scraped across the bike helmet when she ducked. Troy shifted forward, ready to intervene, but Lucy shouted for one more chance. She moved aside, struck the knee, then hit the weak point between the eyebrows until the body stopped reaching. Every movement was ugly, late, and hers. She kept swinging twice after it was already down, then she turned away and vomited beside the curb. Pepper jumped from the backpack and pressed against her ankle, while Volt stood between Lucy and the street without being asked. Both animals stayed pressed beside her, which told you how frightened she actually looked. Troy gave her water while I stayed close without touching her until she steadied herself. Lucy was embarrassed, terrified, and still holding the rod. I told her she had done well. She expected teasing because people often punish fear after demanding courage. Instead, the praise made her stand straighter, and the next time she looked at the body, she looked at it as something she had survived. Lucy asked whether the nausea ever stopped. Troy told her the first kill had made him shake so badly he'd dropped his axe twice, which was a lie told for kindness and one Pepper immediately exposed. Troy admitted the truth was only once. Lucy laughed despite herself, wiped her mouth, and kept the rod. She was still scared, but now she could laugh, stand straight, and keep moving. We reached a shopping mall 2 blocks later because Lucy needed supplies she had chosen herself, and choosing them gave her control. She filled one backpack with medicine, batteries, and clothing while I cleared the nearest stores into the subspace. When a rack vanished, Lucy checked the empty floor twice and finally understood why our group could offer fresh food without carrying visible bags. Pepper tore open a packet of smoked salmon, planted herself on top of it, and announced that canned loyalty had begun. I promised her fresh smoked fish at the mansion. Pepper immediately committed to the household. Lucy reminded the cat that she still had an owner. Pepper answered that ownership without fish was a weak legal theory. Volt had finally met someone more shameless than me, and he hated how quickly she was winning. The mall looked quiet, but one storefront had fresh claw marks across the frame. I recognized the pattern too late to keep Lucy entirely out of the danger lane. A rank 3 devourer burst through the display behind her. Glass rolled across the tiles, the shelving collapsed behind its shoulders, and Lucy's backpack strap caught on a metal hook when she tried to move. The mutant was heavier than an ordinary zombie, built for short charges, and capable of detonating its own energy if cornered long enough. Lucy had no time to activate another buff before it crossed the aisle. Pepper screamed into every nearby mind, and Troy was too far around the corner to reach her before impact. Volt hit first, slamming lightning into the devourer's face, forcing its charge half a step sideways. That half step was enough. I formed the 20-second void sword, cut Lucy's trapped strap on the way past, and crossed behind the creature as it turned toward Volt. The devourer realized the dog had created an opening and tried to redirect its charge, but Lucy's earlier boost still sharpened my movement. I cut through its neck in one clean arc before it could trigger anything else. The body fell toward Lucy. I caught her wrist, pulled her behind me, and turned my shoulder so she didn't take the corpse or the spray from the impact. Troy arrived a second later with his weapon raised, while Pepper climbed Lucy's leg and refused to admit she had been frightened. The danger ended before the devourer understood it had missed, but the cost was visible. I had exposed the full 20-second blade, Lucy's supplies were scattered, and every person in the group now knew stronger mutants were already entering ordinary shopping areas. Once the aisle went quiet, Lucy realized I was still holding her hand. She looked from the dead mutant to the transparent blade fading beside me, then up at my face, and her cheeks turned red with extremely inconvenient timing. Troy saw it, became intensely interested in checking the dead devourer, and gave us exactly 6 feet of privacy. Pepper noticed too, and decided romantic tension was acceptable as long as it didn't delay dinner. Meanwhile, she was doing a very simple calculation. I had fed her, respected her caution, praised her after the first kill, and crossed a mall faster than the monster trying to eat her. The fact that I was handsome had moved from a minor detail into supporting evidence. I noticed the blush and briefly forgot every smooth line I had survived long enough to learn. Hero timing is a scam. You look impressive for 3 seconds, then the woman looks directly at you and your brain opens a loading screen. So I asked the useful question instead. Would Lucy become my partner and join the group? She squeezed my hand once before letting go. Lucy clarified that she meant combat and survival partners for now, then accepted with a smile that made "for now" sound extremely temporary. I told her "for now" was doing suspiciously heavy work in that sentence. Lucy's blush deepened, but she didn't retreat or take the words back. The devourer had changed danger into trust, and the hand she'd released stayed close enough to reach again. Pepper celebrated because partnership guaranteed better fish. Volt turned away because the cat had converted one mall trip into food, housing, and diplomatic immunity. Troy privately admitted the cat had negotiated better terms than he had. Lucy took her backpack and stood beside me instead of behind Troy, but she still refused to abandon the apartment permanently while Megan might return. She'd travel with us only if we kept a path back to her sister. Pepper proposed a note, my mansion, and the fresh fish she had already emotionally purchased. So Lucy wrote Megan our route, placed the note beneath the inner door where only her sister would look, and chose the compromise: 1 meal at my mansion, followed by a move close enough that Megan could still find her. Lucy had accepted partnership, but she still refused to leave for good while Megan might return. With her note already beneath the inner door, Pepper reminded Lucy that waiting hungry wouldn't bring Megan home faster and demanded we discuss fresh fish at my mansion. And who had won the relocation argument before I finished discussing it? Pepper, obviously. At the mansion, Sophie served a feast large enough to make Lucy stop halfway through the entry hall. Hot ribs, fresh vegetables, fruit, bread, and chilled drinks covered the table, while the city outside had already started fighting over cans. Lucy had spent the previous week dividing crackers into exact portions, so the sight of steam rising from several dishes made her check the windows as if somebody might arrest us for abundance. Sophie handed her a plate and told her the only rule was eating before Volt negotiated for seconds. Pepper climbed onto a chair and inspected the fish portion like a union representative. Volt watched from the opposite side, still offended that the new animal had arrived with no combat record and immediate dining privileges. Lucy ate, thanked Sophie twice, and still looked toward the door every few minutes. She enjoyed the safety, but guilt kept pulling her back to the apartment because Megan would search there first. So I offered the only solution that respected her loyalty: we'd move the active household to the sisters' building or occupy nearby houses until Megan returned. Troy looked at the food, then at the moving crates, and accepted that my survival strategy had become geographically responsive to beautiful women. Sophie asked whether the kitchen was coming. I told her the important half was already inside my subspace. The entire group relocated that afternoon because Lucy wouldn't abandon her sister. I stored the supplies, Troy checked nearby units, Sophie carried the knives she trusted, and Pepper supervised from a cushion while contributing nothing. Volt took a larger bag only after the cat insulted the first one. The move cost fuel, visibility, and a secure routine, but Lucy saw us carry that cost instead of demanding she cut off someone she loved. At Lucy's home, I restored power with a generator, filled the refrigerator, lit the rooms, and placed fresh food on the counter. The hallway neighbors heard the generator and began wondering which apartment still had resources, so Troy covered the entrance while we kept every curtain closed. Abundance solved hunger and created attention in the same minute. Then I took out a chilled watermelon, exactly what Gavin had told me Lucy loved. Lucy stared at it, touched the cold rind, and hugged me before either of us prepared for the contact. My composure survived zombies, mutants, and $1 billion stock sale. One warm woman pressed against my chest over a watermelon, and suddenly I had no idea where my hands belonged. In my defense, the fruit had done excellent advance work. Lucy realized what she had done, stepped back blushing, and told me meeting our group was the luckiest thing that had happened since the outbreak. She tried explaining that the hug was mostly about Megan, safety, and watermelon, then stopped when Pepper asked which percentage belonged to me. Lucy stepped back, but she stayed close enough that the answer was already visible. Then she asked how I'd known her favorite fruit. I admitted I'd researched both sisters before the outbreak because talented allies were worth homework. Lucy called that either thoughtful or slightly alarming. I told her the watermelon vote seemed to favor thoughtful, and Pepper backed me because alarming people still bought fish. Lucy laughed and kept one hand on the cold rind, which meant the defense had passed for now. Sophie saw the whole thing and hid a smile behind a plate. Troy carried another battery inside because he valued his life. Volt leaned against my leg like he had personally arranged the romance. Rooms took 2 sentences, Lucy kept hers, Sophie stayed near the kitchen, Troy guarded the entrance side, and I used the spare room. Volt claimed my rug until Pepper called it low-status housing. I gave Lucy cores and told her to strengthen the 1/3 support boost first. She agreed and still kept the iron rod beside her bed. Pepper objected to my room choice with the confidence of a landlord reviewing an unauthorized tenant. The cat announced she'd sleep with me that night, then alternate between my room and Lucy's, so neither human became emotionally dependent. Lucy accused her of chasing fish. Pepper called that an unfair simplification of a complex relationship. You can judge the arrangement. I had survived the end of the world once, and now a cat was assigning custody of herself between 2 bedrooms. While we settled in, Megan Beaumont was still fighting her way home across Lakebridge. She traveled with 2 male classmates who had followed her after the outbreak. One carried protein bars and the other carried beef jerky, but neither carried his share of the danger. At the first intersection, the protein bar simp claimed his ankle hurt until Megan burned a path. At the next block, the jerky simp shouted warnings from behind a parked car while she fought alone. Whenever zombies approached, both men fell behind Megan and let her fire clear the route, then reappeared once the danger was low enough to offer advice. Megan's power was strong, but every flame drained stamina. She could throw a wave across the road, yet each use left her shoulders heavier and her steps shorter. The simps saw the flames and assumed she could protect them forever. Megan saw their clean clothes and regretted allowing either man to follow. By the time they reached the sisters' block, her breathing was rough, her sleeves were burned at the cuffs, and the 2 men were still debating which snack made the better romantic gift. Meanwhile, both simps had convinced themselves they were protecting her emotionally. This is what happens when uselessness gets enough confidence to write its own resume. Megan entered the apartment building with fire ready in one hand. At the inner door, she found Lucy's note with our route and my name, proof that her sister had left by choice instead of vanishing. The working generator and fresh footprints told her the route had already come back home, but she still expected an empty apartment or a fight. Lucy ran into the hallway and hugged her. The sisters held each other so tightly that the whole room went quiet. Megan checked Lucy's face, arms, and neck for injuries, while Lucy kept repeating that she was safe. Megan had crossed the city believing Lucy might be dead. Lucy had waited behind one door believing Megan might never return. For several seconds, the apocalypse lost the room. The household gave them the hallway, and even Pepper stayed quiet against Lucy's ankle. Then Lucy pulled back and showed Megan the helmet scrape, the iron rod, and the faint light around her hands. She displayed the ripped sleeve, the iron rod, and the faint light around her hands to prove she'd learned to survive while waiting. Megan's relief deepened because the little sister she expected to rescue had already begun rescuing herself. Then Megan noticed the rest of my household, the working lights and the smell of dinner. She was relieved that Lucy looked healthy, well-fed, and stronger. Lucy's clothes were clean, her cheeks had color, and a faint support glow still moved around her hands. Megan noticed every detail and understood somebody had protected her sister properly. She was also immediately suspicious of the calm man standing inside her home, like the household had rearranged itself around him. She found me attractive, which annoyed her because suspicion was easier when the stranger didn't have good shoulders and a working refrigerator. The two classmates noticed something else, as their eyes bounced from Megan to Lucy and finally to the food. Within seconds, they had upgraded the reunion into a dating competition. The protein bar simp offered Lucy his best bar and explained that supplies were precious. He held it with both hands like a marriage proposal sponsored by processed oats. Lucy thanked him, declined, and looked past his shoulder toward the full table Sophie had prepared. The rejection embarrassed him because he had planned the gesture during 3 separate zombie attacks. The beef jerky simp offered Megan half a bag and implied he had kept her alive on the road. Megan's eyes narrowed because she had spent the whole trip burning zombies while he protected cured meat. She reminded him that his most useful contribution had been dropping a flashlight in the correct direction. Lucy looked away to hide a smile, and the jerky bag slowly lowered in his hand. Their gifts were scraps inside a house with fresh steak, fruit, and working refrigeration. The status objects had betrayed them before I spoke. They asked who I was. Lucy called me her partner. Both men heard the word and lost what remained of their judgment. The protein bar simp accused me of hiding while Megan fought outside. He had never seen me fight, but Lucy's word threatened the heroic story he had written about himself. The jerky simp claimed any real man would share the mansion's food equally, preferably starting with 2 men who had just arrived. Then both demanded that Volt be removed because feeding a dog during shortages was wasteful. Their eyes stayed on the meat, and Volt noticed before anyone else. Volt's ears lifted as Megan warned them to stop. She told the room exactly what they had contributed on the road, hiding, complaining, and eating the food they offered only after reaching safety. That public correction should have ended it. Instead, the jerky simp threatened to cook Volt if we ran low on meat. Threatening Volt after seeing that table was spectacularly dumb. Tell me what part of that plan sounded survivable. He had insulted the owner, challenged the women he wanted to impress, and threatened the future Storm King within biting distance. The protein bar simp doubled down and stepped toward me. He wanted a public challenge because backing away would confirm everything Megan had said. The jerky simp moved beside him, though half a step behind, and promised they could take over security if I surrendered the supplies. Lucy stepped closer to me. Sophie put down the serving knife. Megan folded her arms and waited to see whether the men would finally hear themselves. I looked at Volt and told him, "Handle it outside." Volt moved before either man finished reacting. Lightning knocked the first into the hall, and Troy blocked the second from reaching Lucy. The jerky simp shouted that Megan owed them after everything they had done, which finally killed the last trace of sympathy in her face. Megan didn't defend them. She had warned them, exposed them, and watched them choose one final threat anyway. Outside the building, Volt finished both men quickly. Megan watched from the doorway long enough to confirm the outcome, then turned back inside without defending people who had treated her as a shield and Lucy as a prize. The neighbors listening behind their doors learned 2 things at once. The sisters had powerful protection, and threatening the black dog was an excellent way to shorten a conversation. When Volt returned, Pepper informed him that his technique lacked elegance. Volt shook rainwater across her favorite chair. Volt had removed 2 parasites, but the harder problem remained inside the house. Megan had watched Volt obey one command: Troy protect Lucy without hesitation, and every member moved before panic spread. She respected the coordination even while resenting the man at its center. Megan knew I had protected Lucy, but she had her own power, her own judgment, and no reason to accept a stranger as captain. She thanked me for keeping Lucy alive, then immediately questioned why my group had moved into her apartment and why everyone followed my decisions without debate. Gratitude and suspicion were both real, which made the coming conflict stronger than simple hostility. She stood beneath the working lights, looked across the food and people arranged around me, and understood that 2 leaders were now sharing one roof. So, I asked Lucy to speak with me privately before the next crisis forced the question for us. After Volt removed the 2 simps, I pulled Lucy into the spare room and asked who made the final call during danger. If Megan ordered retreat while I ordered attack, the team would split. If Lucy hesitated, her support buff might reach nobody before Teeth did. We could argue over meals and bedrooms later. In a horde, we needed one voice. Lucy hated choosing between the sister who'd protected her for years and the man who'd protected her all week. She made me promise the household could challenge bad decisions outside active danger, then chose me as captain and asked me to give Megan a reason she could respect. So we turned dinner into a visible choice, shameless method included. That evening, Sophie covered the table with spicy Cajun meat, roasted vegetables, fresh bread, and a bowl of green grapes placed where Megan could smell them. 5 people were meant to sit, but only 4 chilled bottles stood beside the plates. You could see the exclusion before I said one word. Megan entered, looked at the amount of food, and immediately protested. She had crossed starving streets where people fought over crackers, so a feast large enough for leftovers looked reckless and insulting. She counted the plates, noticed the missing bottle, and understood somebody had arranged the insult before she arrived. Sophie kept serving because stopping would let Megan seize the table before I asked for a choice. Lucy stared at her own hands, regretting the pain but still holding to the plan. I told her the supplies were mine and the table was for members of my group. She pulled out the 5th chair anyway. I stopped her before she touched the food. The room went quiet for a concrete reason. Every other person had a plate, a bottle, and a place. Megan had strength, beauty, and the future ceiling of the Scarlet Queen, yet at that table she had no accepted role. I told her she could eat after choosing whether she stood with my group under one captain. Megan slammed one palm against the table, and heat rolled across the dishes. One glass rattled onto its side, the dog stood, and our armored frontliner shifted between the fire user and the curtains because household politics didn't need to become a building fire. Megan accused me of using food to control hungry people, which was partly true and therefore landed harder. She demanded to know whether every recruit had to kneel for dinner. I told her everyone at the table had already risked something for the group, including me. She was being asked to choose, not beg. Lucy spoke first and told Megan that I had never forced her to stay, had moved the entire household for her peace of mind, and had trusted her with chores after one day. Lucy chose my command because she had seen what it protected. Troy followed by placing his bottle beside my plate. He explained that I warned him before the outbreak, exposed Dana without asking for blind faith, and entered the rat fight when his armor failed. He also admitted I was annoying, controlling, and too willing to assign chores to animals. The dog approved the final point. Troy trusted the man who kept showing up before the danger finished arriving. Sophie didn't make a speech. She set down the serving spoon and told Megan that I had pulled her away from zombies after the people she fed threw her outside. Then Sophie served everyone except herself until Megan understood that her loyalty was personal, not purchased by one meal. Sophie had access to the same kitchen and food, yet she still chose the man who gave her a locking door instead of the woman who happened to share her power element. The pets settled beside my chair, and the cat projected that my leadership package included smoked fish and acceptable bedding, which was the most shameless political endorsement in Lakebridge. Megan looked toward Lucy again, hoping her sister would soften the result. Lucy held her ground even while guilt tightened her face. She told Megan she loved her and still believed the household survived better with my information and one final command. That sentence hurt both sisters, and neither looked away. Every person in the house chose me while Megan stood beside a feast prepared partly for her. Megan refused the food because pride wouldn't let hunger make the decision. Blame her pride if you want. After crossing a city on fire, she was never surrendering over dinner, and I respected that even while making the situation worse. Megan left the table, refused the bottle Sophie offered afterward, and shut herself inside the room she believed was hers. She wanted distance from me, from Lucy's choice, and especially from the smell of her favorite food. Then she opened the top drawer and discovered my underwear folded inside. The door opened again immediately. Megan held the offending evidence between 2 fingers and demanded to know why my clothes were in her room. Troy vanished toward the stairwell. Sophie bit the inside of her cheek. Pepper projected a helpful suggestion that territorial disputes could be settled through scent, and every human ignored her. Lucy explained that I had slept there while we waited for Megan with Lucy's permission because the other rooms were occupied. That answer didn't help. Megan had returned to find a strange man living in her home, commanding her sister, feeding everyone, and occupying her bedroom. Now his underwear had achieved more territorial success than the 2 classmates who followed her across the city. The ridiculous object turned anger into embarrassment, which was worse because she had begun noticing me as a man before finding proof that I had slept 5 feet from her sister. She ordered me to remove everything. I did, because this was one fight I didn't need the fabric winning. After a hot bath, Megan's anger cooled enough for hunger to become louder. She sat alone while outside her door, I praised the green grapes in an intentionally excessive voice. I discussed the sweetness, the crunch, and the tragic burden of having too many. The grape warfare was petty. I regret nothing about the grapes. Megan opened the door, saw me eating her favorite fruit, and understood that Gavin's ridiculous intelligence work had found its target. I offered her 1 grape. She told me where I could place it. I ate it instead because the euphemism department was already working overtime. She wanted the bowl and also wanted to throw it at me, while attraction complicated the second impulse enough to annoy her even more. Instead of surrendering, she entered Lucy's room and attacked the one person who knew my plan. Megan tickled her younger sister until Lucy admitted the dinner had been a captaincy test. Lucy tried resisting, then Pepper betrayed her by announcing that Lucy had rehearsed the loyalty line twice before dinner. Megan stopped long enough to glare at the cat, and Pepper moved behind the pillow while maintaining that transparency strengthened families. Lucy explained that one command structure mattered, that she had chosen me, and that the missing bottle had been deliberate. Megan stopped laughing because she was angry at Lucy for participating, but she also understood the real question. She looked at her sister, then at the full table, and finally at the scorch mark her own palm had left. Food proved I owned the supplies, and Lucy's choice proved the household trusted me. What remained was whether I could keep them alive at the front. Megan had survived the city by making decisions under fire, and she'd never hand that responsibility to a man because he stocked better grapes. If I wanted command, I had to meet the standard that kept her alive, so Megan decided I had to beat her. She left the apartment to find cup noodles rather than eat my food. The streets were dangerous, her stamina hadn't fully recovered, and she still chose a convenience store shelf because pride was currently driving the vehicle. I sent Volt and Pepper after her without asking permission. Volt provided actual protection while Pepper supplied constant commentary about humans leaving safe houses to defend their relationship with dehydrated noodles. Megan noticed the animals following and understood I had protected her despite the argument, which made staying angry cleaner in theory than practice. She killed 2 zombies near the store, while Volt covered the blind corner and Pepper warned about movement behind the shelves. The side trip cost energy and proved she still belonged inside the team even before accepting its captain. Once Megan was out of hearing range, I admitted to Lucy that I had pushed too hard. A single command structure was necessary. Publicly humiliating Megan before she understood the household had damaged trust I still needed. So I stopped defending the dinner stunt and asked Sophie to make a real short-rib noodle bowl. When Megan returned carrying beef-flavor cup noodles, Sophie placed the steaming bowl on the counter beside them. Real short rib, fresh broth, vegetables, and heat rolled through the room, while Megan's package promised beef flavor in letters smaller than the cooking instructions. Volt sat beside Sophie's bowl. Pepper sat beside Megan's package. Even the animals had chosen sides in the culinary dispute. The short rib bowl turned dinner into psychological warfare. Megan accused me of trolling her, and I admitted it immediately before apologizing for the dinner method. I told her I still needed one captain, but I should have given her a test based on the thing she respected, strength under pressure. So I proposed a duel in 3 days. If I lost, I would follow her command. If I won, she'd accept mine. Megan studied me carefully because, at rank 3, my current power didn't obviously exceed hers, and she believed distance plus fire would decide the fight quickly. She asked about weapons, outside help, and surrender. I proposed an open practice lot, no help, and immediate stop once either person could land a killing move. Megan warned me she'dn't go easy because Lucy liked me. I told her I was counting on the opposite, because a gentle Scarlet Queen would prove nothing. That name made her eyes narrow even though she didn't know the future title, and the rivalry picked up a little heat that had nothing to do with fire. She accepted because the wager gave her dignity, measurable rules, and the chance to reverse the table humiliation in front of everyone. Lucy watched the agreement and understood the sisters had finally moved from resentment into a conflict with an honest endpoint. Sophie started planning breakfast around the duel because every household crisis now required catering. Meanwhile, the rare Rat King core still waited in storage. Common cores had stalled, and absorbing that boss core safely was my only realistic path to rank 4 before the duel. I told Megan she should train seriously because even Volt might surprise her. Megan's eyes flashed as she demanded, "Did you just compare me to the dog?" Volt barked from the hallway, personally offended by the phrase, "the dog." Megan stepped closer and told me to enjoy my final 3 days as captain. I told her to enjoy the short-rib noodles before pride made them cold. She took the bowl while maintaining direct eye contact, which counted as a tactical retreat and a culinary victory. Megan tasted one bite, tried to hide the reaction, and failed when Sophie offered to pack the leftovers. I asked whether good broth counted as surrender. Megan said it counted as evidence that my chef had better judgment than her captain, then took a second bite. The duel was set, and the household knew the deadline. Sophie began calculating meals around training, Troy volunteered to judge the distance, and Lucy looked relieved that the conflict now had rules instead of another dinner trap. I had 3 days to reach a rank I hadn't planned to reveal this early. Then someone knocked on the apartment door, and Volt's growl changed from offended employee to warning. Megan thought the fight would decide who led the house. Before we reached the fight, her neighbor decided to bring an army to the front door. The knock after Megan accepted the duel came from Mrs. Keene, the neighbor across the hall. She had been counting generator hours, smelling Sophie's meals, and watching our people move through the building, so the request for food was also reconnaissance. Megan opened the inner panel without unlocking the door. Mrs. Keene cried about hunger, claimed she had nobody else, and asked for enough food to survive one night. She kept glancing past Megan toward the lit hallway, trying to count people and smell what Sophie was cooking. Megan offered directions to an abandoned pantry downstairs, but refused to open the door or hand food through it. Feeding Mrs. Keene once would confirm the apartment had supplies, and the next request would arrive with more mouths and less gratitude. Pepper sat behind Megan and projected one warning into our minds. She feels hostile. Mrs. Keene heard nothing, but she saw Megan glance down and realized the conversation had ended. Her tears stopped before she reached her own door. Megan shut the panel and told me the woman would return with trouble. I nodded because Megan had rejected the neighbor for the same reason I rejected unproven recruits. Compassion without limits became an access route for people who believe need erased consequences. Meanwhile, Mrs. Keene went downstairs and found armed men searching apartments. Their leader had already stripped 3 units and beaten one resident who refused to hand over medicine. Mrs. Keene told them 2 beautiful sisters lived above with food, power, and only a few protectors. She described Megan's fire, the generator, and the black dog, turning every detail she had collected at the door into an attack plan. Then she encouraged the men to take the supplies and treat the women as part of the reward. The tears had only been reconnaissance for a woman willing to sell the sisters to armed predators. The gang came that afternoon carrying knives, pipes, 2 guns, and the confidence of men who had preyed on weaker apartments already. They kicked open doors on the way up so every resident would hear them coming, because fear had worked in the lower floors. Several had newly awakened powers, which made them dangerous enough to produce cores and arrogant enough to announce themselves. Among them, one hardened his forearms like stone while a second pushed short bursts of force through a metal pipe. They had real advantages and had spent them entirely on bullying people with none. I heard them on the stairwell and told Troy and Volt to handle the fight outside. When Troy asked why the location mattered, I reminded him that we had just cleaned the corridor. Look, survival priorities can coexist: kill the invaders, protect the household, and keep blood off the carpet when practical. Troy stepped into the hall wearing repaired armor. Volt moved beside him with lightning crawling over black fur. From the doorway, the gang saw 1 man and 1 dog and started laughing. Their leader mocked Troy's armor, called Volt emergency meat, and promised to save the sisters after removing the men controlling them. Mrs. Keene stood behind the group, already imagining herself receiving our pantry as commission. Megan watched through the panel. She had seen Troy carry bodies and Volt threaten simps, but she hadn't yet watched them fight as a coordinated front line. The first attacker fired, and the bullet struck Troy's chest plate before flattening against reinforced alloy, but Troy kept walking. The gunman fired again, this time toward the helmet, but Troy raised one plated arm and closed the distance while the shooter backed into his own men. Behind the panel, the healer gripped the doorframe while our chef raised a ready flame, yet neither woman interfered because Troy had the lane under control. The leader's smile changed when another awakened man charged with hardened arms, hit Troy across the shoulder, and discovered Troy's body enhancement absorbed far more force than expected. Troy caught him by the jacket and threw him down the stair landing. The impact knocked 2 men into the wall and broke the formation their leader had planned. Meanwhile, the hardened attacker had entered expecting 1 punch to settle the fight. Now he was looking up at a guard who had barely moved and wondering why Mrs. Keene had described Troy as ordinary. Volt attacked the group behind him. Lightning crossed the metal railing, knocked 2 men off their feet, and forced the gunman to drop his weapon before he fired again. The laughter ended all at once. 8 men had climbed the stairs to bully 2 women, then acted betrayed when 1 guard and a dog refused to be easy. Would you call that courage? Neither did the residents listening behind their doors. Mrs. Keene tried backing down the stairs. Pepper sensed the movement and warned Megan, who opened the door just enough to block the escape with a wall of fire across the lower landing. The neighborhood vulture had recruited predators and discovered the apartment already contained worse ones. Troy held the front while Volt struck anyone reaching for a weapon. Megan's fire sealed the exit without entering the melee, and the gang's numbers collapsed into a crowded disadvantage. The force user tried blasting Troy off balance, but Volt hit him during the wind-up. The second gunman raised his weapon toward the door, so Megan narrowed the firewall across his hands and made him drop it. Every member solved the threat in front of them, and for the first time Megan saw the command structure working without me speaking twice. Their leader begged after the last gun failed. He blamed Mrs. Keene, promised to leave the building, and offered information about other survivor groups. Mrs. Keene shouted that he had misunderstood her, which was bold considering everyone had heard the plan on the stairs. Troy didn't answer, because the same man had announced what he planned to do to the sisters less than a minute earlier. The fight ended outside, exactly as requested. When the lightning faded, Mrs. Keene and the attackers were dead on the stairs. They had brought weapons to the wrong household, and Troy and Volt ended the argument before anyone inside had to open the door. The bodies left us with an uglier task. Several attackers had awakened, so their bodies carried usable cores. I handed Lucy a knife because a healer who might judge future recruits needed to understand the ugly source of power herself. She asked Troy to do it. I refused, while Megan held the light and stayed beside her. Lucy fought the first resistant core free, turned away to vomit, washed her hands, and came back. Megan guided without taking over. Troy boxed each recovered core, and Sophie waited with a clean cloth. When Lucy finished, she placed the last core in my hand with shaking fingers. Back inside, Sophie served lunch while Troy changed the damaged chest plate, and Volt tracked one black paw across the freshly cleaned tile. My no-cleanup strategy had achieved mixed results. Megan noticed something more important. The refrigerator had been full before breakfast. We had eaten heavily, packed food for training, and fed 5 people plus 2 animals. Yet when she opened it after the fight, every shelf was full again. She closed the door, waited, and opened it a second time. Then Megan removed a carton of eggs, set it on the counter, and checked the back shelf where an identical carton still sat. Sophie kept cooking while pretending not to enjoy the investigation. Lucy lasted 30 seconds before laughing, and Megan understood everyone else had been waiting for her to catch up. The refilled shelves finally made Megan stop treating the refrigerator like a kitchen appliance, and she had gathered enough evidence to demand the rule. Lucy told her about my time-frozen storage ability. She explained that I could preserve food, retrieve equipment, and move huge supplies without carrying them. Megan looked from Lucy to me, then toward the endless refrigerator. The dinner test suddenly made more sense and irritated her in a completely new direction. I had denied her one meal while privately holding enough food for years. At the same time, she finally understood why Lucy had trusted the relocation, why Sophie could cook without ration panic, and why my group planned beyond the next can. The secret raised my value and the scale of what I had risked by showing it. Megan called me insufferable, and I told her accurate descriptions didn't count as new information. Common cores alone had stalled, so I brought out the Rat King core I'd saved since the grain facility. The crystal held compressed mutant energy strong enough to bridge the gap, but absorbing it felt like forcing cold metal through every nerve behind my eyes. I sat against the wall, controlled my breathing, and kept the subspace stable while transparent pressure spread through my body. My support user steadied my pulse, the chef cleared anything fragile from the room, and our frontliner guarded the door because a rank breakthrough was exactly when outside trouble liked to become interesting. Megan watched without teasing because she had wanted proof of power and was now seeing the price before the result. The pain was the price of using a boss core far denser than anything my current body had absorbed, and the energy refused to settle cleanly. Then the pressure broke, and I reached awakening rank 4. The gang's cores had stabilized me before I used the saved rat core, so the threshold came earlier than expected, and I shortened the duel to the next breakfast. Every loose object in the room shifted half an inch toward me. Volt's fur rose, Sophie caught a glass before it tipped, and Megan stopped pretending the breakthrough was just a larger energy pool. Space itself had started answering faster. Space around me became easier to grip. Distance stopped feeling fixed, and for the first time in this timeline, I could step through a short gap instead of crossing it normally. A portion of energy remained in the core, so I gave it to Pepper. The cat absorbed the fragment, arched her back, and immediately announced that growth required smoked fish. Volt protested that the newcomer was receiving boss loot before completing basic chores. I tested the new movement before the argument became a labor strike. Megan stood in the hallway holding a bowl of green grapes. Volt guarded the doorway, still watching Pepper. I focused on the space beside Megan and stepped. The living room vanished, and I appeared in the hall, struck the edge of Megan's bowl, and scattered grapes across the floor. 3 rolled beneath our frontliner's boots, 1 landed inside the dog's water dish, and the cat chased another purely because chaos had become available. A startled spark hit the wall while the household stared at the empty place I had occupied, and Megan's favorite food became the first casualty of rank 4. Megan spun with fire in her hand. She had not seen me cross the room because I had not crossed it. Space Step was the movement technique I needed to challenge Megan on equal terms. Volt stared at me with personal betrayal. Running had been one of his few remaining advantages over management, and Space Step had removed it. Megan looked at the scattered grapes, then at the distance behind me, and understood the duel had changed. The next morning, in the practice lot outside the building, Troy measured 20 meters between us. Cold air moved through the broken windows, and several hidden neighbors watched from above because 2 awakened fighters announcing a duel had become the building's best entertainment. Behind a concrete barrier, the rest of the household watched Megan roll fire across both hands. She had eaten breakfast, recovered stamina, and chosen open ground where her range should matter. No one could claim the test favored me. I told her I could force surrender within 3 seconds. She laughed because even with short-range movement, she believed fire and distance would keep me from controlling her that quickly. Megan had seen one uncontrolled step in a hallway, not a combat application, and she expected the technique to have a cooldown or fixed landing point. So she raised the stakes with a bizarre wager: the loser would accept 1 kick from the winner. The household reacted exactly as you'd expect. Lucy protested. Sophie looked away while smiling, and Pepper asked whether the kick affected fish privileges. I agreed, because refusing would sound afraid and because rivalry had already left normal diplomacy several exits behind. Megan warned me not to complain afterward. I told her to start planning the apology instead. Troy raised one hand and stated the rule: no outside help, no lethal follow-through, and the fight ended when one person could no longer defend against a killing move. His hand dropped as Megan released fire across the 20-meter line. "Aye!" Space stepped behind her before the flame reached my starting point. She turned fast, but rank 4 spatial control locked the air around her body. Her arms stopped halfway through the motion. The fire died in her palms and her feet wouldn't leave the ground. 1 full second had passed. Megan pushed harder and felt the space tighten. She tried igniting the air around her instead of moving her hands, but the spatial pressure disrupted the flame before it formed. The neighbors above stopped whispering. Troy's raised counting hand stayed perfectly still. The second count hit Troy's hand. I placed 2 fingers against the back of her neck where a blade could have ended the fight. 3 seconds ended the duel. Troy called the time while Lucy inhaled sharply. Sophie lowered the towel she had been gripping, and even Pepper stopped discussing fish. Megan understood the result without explanation. If I had held a blade, the fight would have ended the same way. The future Scarlet Queen had surrendered in under 3 seconds. The household finally had one captain, and everyone turned toward me to see whether I'd collect the ridiculous public punishment. The 3 seconds ended with Megan locked in place and the whole household waiting for me to collect the wager. Instead, I released the spatial pressure, stepped back, and told her the public punishment was waived. Megan turned slowly because she had expected humiliation after I used food and a dinner table against her. Refusing the kick gave her something she could respect instead. The neighbors watching from the windows expected a victory pose, but I handed Megan the towel our chef had brought and asked whether the spatial lock had hurt. Her shoulders lowered and the windows went quiet. I welcomed her to breakfast, gave her the missing seat, and apologized again for forcing the captaincy question through hunger. Megan asked why I hadn't shown the movement skill before the wager. I told her the technique had only arrived after the rat core, and exposing it early would have been stupid. She accepted the answer because the duel had answered what the dinner couldn't. She knew I could protect the front line, and I knew she'd challenge a bad decision instead of obeying without question. Megan accepted the seat while Lucy exhaled like she had been holding that breath since the missing bottle. She hugged Megan first, then checked me for burns because support healers managed both sides of leadership disputes. Our chef served the spicy dish Megan liked, the 5th drink moved into place, and the pets settled nearby. The cat announced that the political crisis had ended in time for fish, while the dog took the chair nearest Megan because he wanted credit for starting the duel. At the table, we made only 3 decisions. We'd stay together, I'd hold final command during danger, and we'd return to the mansion in Cedar Ridge Estates before recruiting people who proved loyalty, courage, or useful power. Megan kept authority over her own combat choices until a team order became necessary. Lucy managed support priorities, and Sophie controlled food distribution because nobody sane wanted me near seasoning policy. Breakfast ended there, and we started packing. Megan questioned the fallback routes, then placed her empty plate beside mine and told the household she'd follow my command during danger. She had joined by choice after losing, which was worth far more than obedience bought through food. For once, the table did not feel temporary. Then Megan asked to speak privately. Inside the spare room, she locked the door and reminded me that I had waived the wager publicly, not cancelled it. She had agreed to 1 kick, and pride wouldn't let her owe me anything. Megan also wanted the debt handled away from Lucy and Sophie, because rivalry was fun until witnesses turned it into family history. She placed the grape bowl on the dresser, crossed her arms, and ordered me to finish the ridiculous contract. I told her the debt could disappear. Megan turned around and told me to stop acting noble after spending 3 days insulting her with grapes. So I lifted one hand to stop her from repositioning. She pivoted at the same moment, and my palm landed against the back of her hip with a loud enough smack to make both of us freeze. There are moments when the Void Sovereign has no useful technique, and this was one of them. Megan's face went red, and mine probably did too. You can laugh now. I had to keep a straight face while she decided whether to burn me, slap me, or acknowledge that she had moved at the exact wrong moment. She chose a 4th option and pinched my side hard enough to defeat armor. Then she warned that if anyone heard about the accident, I'd need Space Step to leave Lakebridge. I promised secrecy while attempting to regain basic hand discipline. Then I offered her a bowl of green grapes as a ceasefire. She accused me of planning the whole thing. I told her nobody alive could plan that badly on purpose. Megan took the grapes, opened the door, and warned me once more that the accident stayed private. She was still challenging me and enjoying my discomfort, but now she carried the bowl downstairs instead of walking away from the household. At lunch, Megan thanked me for keeping Lucy alive. She had seen the food and power, but the thing that settled her loyalty was her sister's condition when she returned, safe, trained, and still free to argue. Megan admitted she had expected Lucy to be dependent on whoever found her. Instead, Lucy had killed a zombie, strengthened the whole team, and helped force the captaincy decision. Under our protection, Lucy had gained more agency, so we moved back to the mansion in Cedar Ridge Estates that afternoon. I stored the heavy supplies, our frontliner secured the route, the chef reclaimed her kitchen, and the cat complained that relocation had disrupted her bedroom rotation. Megan rode in the truck beside Lucy and watched buildings pass behind armored glass, finally seeing the scale of the route I had been protecting. When the mansion gates opened and the dog's unpaid zombie security wandered nearby, she looked at me and asked whether every part of my operation was this strange. I told her the useful parts were usually stranger. The mansion gave us stronger defenses, more rooms, and neighboring villas for future recruits. It also put more lights, vehicles, and movement behind one set of gates, making the growing household harder to hide. On the road back from a supply sweep the next day, we heard fighting near a service station. 4 former security guards were surrounded by poisonous zombies, and one injured man was already struggling to stand. Their leader was Luis Ortega, a broad man with body-strengthening power and a torn security jacket. Luis Ortega had a clear escape route through the rear fence, but 3 co-workers were still trapped beside the pumps. The ice user was holding a frozen lane with shaking hands, the stone user kept rebuilding a barrier that cracked under every impact, and Brent Callahan, the weaker lightning user, was fighting one-handed after a poisonous claw opened his arm. Luis Ortega ran back into the open, dragged Brent behind a concrete post, and took the next claw strike across his own armor. Ask yourself who runs back into poison when the gate is already open. That choice told me more than any recruitment interview ever could. The poisonous claws carried toxin rather than the zombie infection. Brent's wound was spreading through his arm, but Lucy could still stabilize it if we opened a route to him. I ordered Volt to help. The future Storm King crossed the lot in a black blur and released a lightning blast stronger than Brent's entire output. Brent stared for half a second too long because the dog had just made his best attack look like a flickering porch light. Luis Ortega saw the opening, lifted a zombie off the ground, and threw it into the frozen lane while Megan burned the cluster behind him. The ice user widened the lane once pressure lifted, and the stone user raised a fresh wall for Lucy's approach. Troy joined Luis Ortega at the pumps, and the 2 strength users fought back-to-back without needing an introduction. Lucy activated her support field, giving the exhausted guards enough force to hold their positions, while Sophie held a controlled flame over the retreat route. I space-stepped past the front line and used the Void Sword to cut through the poisonous zombies pressing against the cracked barrier, exposing one more hidden card to 4 strangers because saving them required it. The fight ended with all 4 guards alive. Lucy reached Brent first, cut his sleeve open with medical shears, and pressed glowing hands around the darkened tissue. The discoloration stopped climbing toward his shoulder, his breathing steadied, and the wound closed enough for transport. Lucy swayed afterward because holding the toxin in place drained her hard, and Megan caught her before she hit the pavement. Luis Ortega stayed beside Brent through the treatment even after the route was clear, exactly the kind of loyalty every selfish survivor before him had failed to show. I offered all 4 men a place under my command. Luis Ortega accepted after confirming nobody would be abandoned for slowing the group. I told him loyalty earned rescue, while continued trust would be judged through behavior. Hugo Serrano, the ice user, agreed next because his frozen lane had only worked while others defended him. Eli Navarro, who controlled sand and broken stone, followed after lowering the barrier and checking the injured man first. Brent Callahan, the weaker lightning user, looked at Volt with open respect and accepted before the dog's ego could become physically larger. We returned to Cedar Ridge Estates with 4 new recruits and 1 more responsibility. Would you hand 4 armed strangers every household secret after 1 good fight? Neither would I. The guards took the neighboring villa instead of joining the inner household immediately, and I gave them 1 food drop, a walkie-talkie channel, medical supplies, and clear probation. Megan approved the distance because loyalty had earned rescue, while access to every secret still needed time. They'd keep their own watch rotation, report movement near the estate, and enter the main house only when invited. Luis Ortega accepted without offense because a man responsible for 3 co-workers understood why a captain protected an existing household. Rescue had earned safety, while deeper access would depend on what the 4 men did next. That night, Troy and I listened from the porch while the new men discussed the fight. Brent kept praising Volt's lightning, Luis Ortega called the dog more disciplined than most security teams, and Troy slowly realized a canine had received the group's first hero review. The man competing with a dog for usefulness was having a difficult evening. Volt sat beside him with perfect innocence. By morning, the recruits had kept watch, shared supplies without hiding anything, and answered every radio check. Luis Ortega even returned an unopened food crate because the first drop had been enough, a small choice Troy noticed immediately. The household had become a real faction, which meant stronger factions would notice. So before lunch, Megan and I left Cedar Ridge Estates to scout the commercial district for supplies and survivors worth approaching. Megan came because she knew what capable people looked like under pressure, and because she wanted to see whether my recruitment standards were as annoying outside the house. We checked 2 stripped storefronts and 1 blocked service lane while trading insults about leadership. Megan claimed I recruited anyone who could survive my food politics. I reminded her she'd joined after losing a duel, which earned me a small flame near my sleeve and confirmed our diplomacy was improving. On the next ruined shopping street, a woman in a spotless designer emergency coat stepped into our path like she already owned the conversation, and a quiet ice user followed at her side. The woman blocking our path in Lakebridge's commercial district was Celeste Barron, a fashion CEO and designer who would later build a powerful women-only shelter. Beside her stood Naomi Pierce, the quiet ice user whose future strength would make every serious faction want her. I recognized both women from my first life, but they only saw Megan, me, and the supply bags we'd collected while scouting. Celeste's spotless emergency coat told you plenty before she spoke. The street was ash, broken glass, and dried blood. She looked ready for an apocalypse campaign shoot. She was beautiful, knew it, and approached Megan with the focus of someone inspecting talent she intended to acquire. Naomi Pierce stayed 1 step behind while frost gathered lightly across her fingers. She watched the rooftops, both ends of the street, Megan's fire-scarred sleeves, and my empty hands. Naomi had survived through caution rather than branding, so she respected controlled danger and reserved judgment. Celeste introduced herself to Megan and invited her into an all-female survivor group. Her pitch offered real value: private rooms, shared guards, organized food, approved travel routes, and rules that kept predatory men outside. Her future shelter would protect hundreds of women. The price was Celeste deciding where people lived, whom they trusted, and which relationships counted as safe. Megan asked who made decisions during an attack. Celeste answered that leadership had to stay centralized, then added that relationships capable of compromising security would be reviewed. The answer was efficient, calm, and revealing. Celeste offered Megan a place inside a system where Celeste approved the doors, routes, and people. Celeste also noticed Megan's burned cuffs and offered clean combat clothes from her company's emergency inventory. The gesture was useful and calculated. She wanted Megan imagining comfort inside her shelter before the conversation reached me. Megan thanked her without taking the coat, which was the first small refusal Celeste filed away. Then she looked at me and implied that one powerful woman traveling under a man's command created an obvious problem. In Celeste's mind, Megan hadn't chosen a captain, she'd been collected by a man with supplies and hidden motives. Megan heard the insult beneath the rescue pitch. She respected the safety plan, but Celeste was talking to the future Scarlet Queen like she needed a stranger to identify danger for her. So Celeste asked the question she actually cared about. Is he your boyfriend? What was she really asking? Whether Megan's loyalty was strategic or romantic, because either answer gave her somewhere to push. Megan glanced at me and briefly considered saying something designed purely to make me panic. I saw the temptation and prepared for betrayal from my own ally. Honestly, after the Grape War and the private wager, she had enough material to ruin my composure with one word. Instead, Megan told Celeste, "He's my captain, and I'm staying." Then she stepped half a pace closer to my side. The future Scarlet Queen had received a direct offer from a capable faction leader and visibly chosen the man Celeste was trying to remove. A powerful woman choosing my side had just become a public faction problem, which was flattering for roughly half a second. Celeste's eyes moved from Megan's shoulder to mine, measuring the distance she'd closed. Naomi Pierce noticed too, and the frost across her fingers thinned because Megan's choice made an immediate fight less likely. Nobody on that street needed a relationship label to understand the allegiance. Celeste kept smiling, but her opinion of me hardened. She decided I was a lustful creep using food, safety, and power to keep Megan dependent. Megan defending me only convinced her the manipulation ran deeper. Meanwhile, Megan knew exactly what Celeste was assuming, and it irritated her on my behalf. She'd rejected my food, challenged my command, forced a duel, lost in 3 seconds, and joined afterward. Reducing that entire fight to mind control insulted her judgment as much as mine. Celeste softened her tone and proposed a joint supply raid so both groups could compare methods. She wanted a stage where Megan could watch us perform under pressure, and she expected me to fail on it. I asked where, and Celeste answered, Riverside Mall. That name exposed the problem. Lucy, Volt, and I had already stripped Riverside Mall during the Devourer mission. The useful stores were empty, the medicine was gone, and Pepper had probably stolen the last object in the building with emotional value. Can you see why I paused? Celeste was proposing a supply raid at a location with no supplies, and she didn't know I'd emptied it. Then she offered a 30-70 split. My group would take 30% while hers took 70% because she supposedly provided the location and plan. Celeste presented the numbers like generosity, explaining that her people would coordinate the route and choose the safest entry. Megan held her expression steady while she waited for me to answer. Naomi Pierce watched Celeste instead, because even she knew 70% was an aggressive fee for naming a mall. The split wasn't supposed to be fair. It was supposed to make me protest, bargain, or accept a bad deal in front of Megan. The empty mall told me exactly what this was. Celeste wanted a competence trap, where refusal looked cowardly and a failed raid made me look useless beside Megan. So I performed cowardice immediately. I told Celeste the mall sounded dangerous, the split sounded terrible, and I preferred returning to the mansion. I even asked whether her group could handle the zombies without us, then gave her the cautious smile of a man who'd never fought anything larger than a grocery bill. 10 seconds of wounded pride protected the subspace, the earlier loot, and every combat card Celeste hadn't earned. Megan looked offended for half a second, caught the pause in my eyes, and stayed quiet. She knew I'd recognized something and trusted me enough not to expose it. Celeste took my refusal as proof. Her shoulders relaxed, and she turned toward Megan expecting disappointment. Naomi Pierce did the opposite. She watched my hands, the empty supply bag, and Megan's face, then decided the refusal carried more control than fear. Megan stayed beside me. Celeste had offered safety, solidarity, faction status, and a public chance to make me look small, yet the woman she wanted still didn't move. Naomi Pierce also noticed that I'd reacted to one location, not to the zombies. A true coward would have feared the danger. I'd paused at the address. Celeste asked Megan to reconsider. Megan told her the answer would stay the same until Celeste stopped treating her like property that had wandered into the wrong group. The poaching CEO finally lost the pleasant tone. She warned that men with hidden motives became dangerous during disasters. I agreed, which annoyed her because she couldn't tell whether I meant myself or her. Celeste left with Naomi Pierce, and Megan waited until they crossed the ruined intersection before asking why Riverside Mall mattered. I told her the location was empty and Celeste had no reason to know I knew. Megan understood the information boundary and didn't press. She did, however, ask whether I enjoyed acting helpless in front of beautiful women. I told her it depended on whether the beautiful woman standing beside me planned to defend my reputation. Megan said my reputation had survived worse than cowardice and resumed scouting before I could ask which incident she meant. Celeste had failed to recruit Megan, failed to bait me into Riverside Mall, and failed to turn my refusal into a public loss. But she remained powerful, organized, and certain that separating Megan from me counted as rescue. Across the intersection, Naomi Pierce asked why I'd reacted to the mall name before objecting to the split. Celeste dismissed the pause as fear, because admitting I might know something would damage the story she'd already chosen about me. Naomi let the answer pass, but she didn't stop watching our side of the street. As the two women walked away, Celeste's smile returned for the wrong reason. The mall test had failed, so she began planning a different way to turn Megan against me.